the man you haven't met yet. You already know how to change. That is the problem. You have read the books. You have felt the surge of a Monday morning resolution. You have, more than once, been absolutely certain that this time was different, and then watched yourself, with something between disbelief and dark familiarity, drift back into the exact pattern you swore you were done with. Not because you are weak, not because you lack information, but because the part of you doing the changing and the part of you resisting it are running on the same operating system, one that was built a long time ago for a version of your life that no longer exists. Here is the paradox this book is built on, stated plainly. The man who stops trying to control everything around him becomes the most controlled person in the room. Sit with that for a moment. Don't explain it away yet. In 2019, a researcher studying behavioral change at a university sleep lab made an observation that had nothing to do with sleep. She noticed that the participants who reported the highest levels of anxiety, inconsistency, and self-described lack of discipline shared one trait that had nothing to do with willpower, genetics, or circumstance. They were all, in her words, chronically externally oriented. Their internal state, their sense of stability, direction, even identity, was continuously being written by what was happening outside them. A good response from someone they respected, a setback at work, a number on a scale, the ambient temperature of other people's moods. They weren't undisciplined. They were ungoverned. They had never been shown, or never allowed themselves, to locate the thing inside that doesn't change when the outside does. Within 18 months of a targeted intervention designed around nothing more dramatic than directed internal attention, the majority of them reported changes they described not as improvements, but as recognitions. As if something had always been there, and they had simply learned to stop drowning it out. That is the gap this book is about. Not the gap between who you are and some idealized future version of yourself. The gap between who you currently are and what the evidence, psychological, neurological, behavioral, consistently shows you have been capable of all along. You have probably already tried to close that gap using noise. Not the noise of a busy street. The noise inside, the continuous low-grade hum of distraction, performance, and motion that feels like productivity but functions as anesthesia. The podcast playing the moment you get in the car because silence has started to feel like an accusation. The social media check at 11 p.m. that you don't even remember initiating. The ambitious plan announced to 3 people before a single hour of work was done on it. The announcement somehow satisfying in a way the work never quite does. The noise is not a character flaw. It is a structure, a system you built, probably without knowing it, to avoid hearing something you weren't ready to hear. At 2 a.m., when it goes quiet enough, you hear it anyway. The thing that doesn't sound like motivation or inspiration. The thing that sounds more like, you know exactly what you need to do. You just keep choosing not to do it. And then you reach for your phone. This book is about learning to sit with that voice instead of outrunning it. About developing the capacity to hear what it's actually saying, which is not an indictment. It is a signal, one that has been trying to reach you through the interference for longer than you probably realize. There are 5 concepts that will serve as your framework throughout these pages. You don't need to understand them fully yet. You just need to know they exist, because you are going to start recognizing them everywhere. Sovereignty, the condition of being ungovernable by your own impulses or the unexamined expectations of others. Not control over people, ownership over self. The signal, the internal directive that exists beneath motivation, mood, and emotion. The part of you that knows what needs to happen, regardless of how you feel about it in any given moment. Noise, everything that competes with the signal and wins most of the time. Compression, the deliberate narrowing of your energy, attention, and environment into something concentrated enough to actually move. The old architecture, the unconscious structure of beliefs, habits, and identities built, mostly in childhood and early experience, in response to fear. The thing you have been calling your personality that was actually designed to keep you safe, not capable. These are not motivational concepts. They are diagnostic ones. By the time you reach the final chapter, They will have changed the way you read your own behavior permanently. Here is what this book promises. By the end of it, you will stop negotiating with the version of yourself that was built by fear and begin operating from the version that was built by choice. That is not a small thing, and it will not be accomplished by reading alone. This book will ask you to look at the mechanisms underneath your behavior, not just what you do, but why the pattern persists even when you can see it clearly, even when you hate it, even when you have tried to stop. It will ask you to tolerate some discomfort that the noise has been helping you avoid. It will ask you, at certain points, to sit in a room with yourself and not reach for anything. That is the work. You deserve to know it before you commit to it. Most people never do this, not because they lack intelligence. The people who most need this work are often the most intelligent people in the room, which is part of the problem. Intelligence is extraordinarily useful for building elaborate justifications for staying exactly where you are. It is a tool, and like any tool, its value depends entirely on what it is pointed at. What this book asks is that you point it inward. Honestly, without the performance of self-improvement, the highlighted books and the morning routines posted online, and the identity of someone who is working on themselves, which is sometimes the most sophisticated version of the noise there is. Just the work, quietly, under pressure. The man you haven't met yet is not a fantasy. He is not a better-looking, more successful, more admired projection of your current anxieties. He is simply you, operating from your signal instead of your fear. You, in compression rather than dispersion. You, after the old architecture has been examined, understood, and deliberately, imperfectly, over time, rebuilt. He has been waiting, not impatiently. He does not need you to hurry. But you have kept him waiting long enough. Chapter 1 begins with the thing you reach for when you don't want to think. That is not an accident. It is where this always starts. Chapter 1. The noise you mistake for a life. You are not distracted because you lack focus. You are distracted because distraction is working exactly as intended. That is the thing nobody says out loud. That the phone you pick up for the 14th time before noon is not a failure of willpower. It is a success of avoidance. A precise, efficient, nearly invisible system you have built to ensure that the one conversation you most need to have, the one with yourself, keeps getting postponed. Indefinitely, professionally, with remarkable creativity. The noise is not your enemy. It is your employee. You hired it. You keep promoting it. And it is very, very good at its job. Here is what the noise actually does, structurally. It fills the gap between stimulus and response. That gap, the half-second of silence between something happening and you reacting to it, is where your signal lives, where genuine choice lives, where the version of you that operates from intention rather than reflex has its only available window. The noise closes that window before you even know it was open. Not maliciously, efficiently, because an open window, for a nervous system trained on uncertainty, feels indistinguishable from danger. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological description of what chronic overstimulation does to the brain's capacity for self-directed thought. When the environment is continuously loud enough, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, consequence weighing, and identity-level decision-making, gradually cedes ground to the limbic system, which is faster, louder, and deeply uninterested in your long-term goals. The brain does not distinguish between external noise and internal noise. It responds to volume. And modern life has been engineered, with extraordinary precision and billions of dollars of behavioral research, to stay just loud enough that the quieter signal never quite gets through. You are not losing a battle against your phone. You are losing a battle against an architecture designed by some of the most talented engineers alive, whose professional purpose is to ensure that you never sit still long enough to want something they cannot provide. The researcher Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called flow, the state of absorbed, effortless engagement that people consistently report as among the most satisfying experiences of their lives. What he found, documented across cultures and disciplines, was not that people needed more stimulation to reach this state. They needed less. Specifically, they needed an environment in which the internal signal, interest, curiosity, the pull toward a specific kind of challenge, could be heard over the ambient noise of obligation, performance, and social monitoring. Flow, in his framework, was not a reward for talented people. It was the natural condition of a nervous system that had been given enough quiet to orient toward what it actually cared about. The reason most people experience flow rarely, if at all, is not that they lack talent or passion. It is that they have never, in their adult lives, sustained silence long enough to find out what they actually care about, as distinct from what they have been told to care about, what earns approval, what performs well in public, and what keeps the anxiety at a manageable frequency. This is where the noise becomes something more than inconvenient. It becomes definitional. You are, in a very real sense, the sum of what you pay attention to. And if your attention has been continuously rented out, to feeds, to opinions, to the ambient performance of being a person with things happening, then the self that emerges from that attention is not fully yours. It is assembled from borrowed material. It looks like a personality. It functions like a reaction. Think about the last time you sat in genuine silence. Not meditation as productivity, not a walk with podcasts, not the silence of exhaustion at the end of a day that used every available moment to avoid this exact moment. Actual silence. No input. No task. Just you and whatever surfaces when there is nothing to surface but you. For most people, that silence lasts approximately 90 seconds before it becomes unbearable. Notice what makes it unbearable. It is not boredom, exactly. Boredom implies a kind of neutral waiting. What surfaces in the silence is more specific than that. It is the thing you have been outrunning, the assessment you have been avoiding, the knowledge, sitting there with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be, that the gap between what you are doing and what you know you are capable of is wider than you want to look at directly. The noise doesn't cause that gap. The noise just makes it possible to not look at it. And here is where the chapter turns, because this is the part that is almost never said. The gap is not a condemnation. It is a signal. The discomfort you feel in the silence is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of calibration, the part of you that knows the difference between where you are and where your signal is pointing. Animals don't feel this particular discomfort. They don't lie awake at 2 a.m. with the specific ache of unlived potential. That ache is information. It is the most honest thing about you. And you have been turning up the volume on everything else so you don't have to hear it. The practical consequence of this is something behavioral scientists call attentional fragmentation, the progressive reduction in your capacity to sustain a single line of thought long enough for it to develop into something useful. Each interruption, each notification, each context switch does not merely pause your thinking. It resets it. The cognitive cost of returning to a complex task after an interruption has been studied extensively, with estimates suggesting it takes anywhere from 15 to 23 minutes to return to the depth of engagement you had before the break. Not the task, the depth. Most people working in high-stimulation environments never return to that depth at all. They work in a continuous state of partial engagement, doing a reasonable impression of focus while actually operating at a fraction of their available cognitive capacity. This is not a minor inefficiency. Over years, it means you have been thinking at perhaps 40% of the depth you are capable of. The ideas that needed longer to form never formed. The connections that required sustained attention were never made. You have been making decisions about your work, your relationships, your direction, with a mind that has been operating like a browser with 47 tabs open, each one drawing processing power from the others, none of them fully loaded. And somehow, you have been attributing the results to your talent, or lack of it. A man I know, mid-30s, ran a moderately successful business, had every external signal of competence, once described his mental life as feeling like he was always slightly behind himself. He was perpetually catching up to a version of events that had already moved on. He made decisions reactively. He processed conversations hours after they ended. He had ideas in the shower that he lost by the time he reached for his phone. He assumed this was simply how his mind worked, a kind of cognitive style. He did one thing differently for 30 days. He removed every notification from his phone. Not the apps, the notifications. He did not meditate. He did not journal. He did not adopt a morning routine. He simply stopped allowing the noise to initiate contact. He described what happened in the second week as alarming, not in a negative sense. He said it felt like a room he had been moving through in the dark had slowly had its lights turned on, and he could see, for the first time, where the furniture actually was. His thinking, he said, stopped chasing itself. Ideas arrived and stayed long enough to be examined. He began to notice the difference between what he wanted and what he had simply been responding to, two things he had never previously been able to distinguish. He had not changed. His mind had not changed. The signal had been there the entire time. He had simply turned the noise down far enough to hear it. The practice, the 30-minute window. Once per day, morning is preferable, but any consistent time works. Create a 30-minute window of total input silence. No phone, no music, no podcast, no reading. You may write by hand if the silence becomes genuinely unbearable, but writing is the only permitted output. Do not set an intention for this window. Do not use it to plan or problem solve. Its only job is to let the noise dissipate enough that you can begin to hear what is underneath it. For the first 3 to 5 days, this will feel unproductive, vaguely anxious, and possibly pointless. That feeling is the old architecture objecting to the absence of stimulation it has been trained to expect. It is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is beginning. Notice, during this window, what surfaces without invitation. What thought keeps returning. What you feel the pull toward when nothing external is pulling. You do not need to act on it. You do not need to analyze it. Just notice. You are learning to read a signal you have been jamming for years. It will take a few days before the transmission becomes clear. This is not a productivity hack. It is a diagnostic tool. You are finding out what your mind does when it is finally left alone with itself. Most people will read this chapter and agree with it completely. They will feel the recognition, the slight uncomfortable accuracy of it, and they will think, yes, that is true. I should do something about that. And then they will put the book down and pick up their phone, because the pull of the noise is not weakened by understanding it. Understanding is necessary. It is not sufficient. The gap between knowing and doing is not an intellectual problem. It is an architectural one, built into the old architecture in ways that this chapter has only begun to name. The noise is the symptom. What it is protecting is the subject of Chapter 2. You reach for the noise because the signal is asking something of you that you are not yet sure you are willing to give. That sentence will make more sense by the time you finish the next chapter. Chapter 2 is where you meet the signal properly, not as a concept, but as the specific neurological and psychological reality that has been competing with the noise for your attention since before you had words for either. The question Chapter 1 leaves open: if the noise is chosen, what exactly are you choosing it over? Chapter 2, the signal. Every person alive has, at some point, known exactly what they needed to do and not done it. Not because they lacked information, not because the path was unclear, but because knowing and doing are governed by entirely different systems, and the one that governs doing is older, faster, and far less interested in your conscious intentions than you have been assuming. Understanding this is not humbling. It is liberating, because it means the problem was never your character. It was your architecture. And architecture can be rebuilt. There is something operating inside you beneath the layer of thought, below the internal monologue, below preference and mood, and the continuous low-grade negotiation between what you want and what you feel like doing right now. Psychologists have approached it from different angles: intrinsic motivation, autonomous regulation, the organismic valuing process. Neuroscientists locate pieces of it in the anterior insula, the default mode network, the anterior cingulate cortex. The specific terminology matters less than what they all, across decades and disciplines, keep arriving at. There is a part of you that knows. Not in a mystical sense, in a functional one. A signal that registers misalignment before you can articulate it. The specific discomfort when you say yes to something you needed to say no to, before you have even finished the sentence. The pull toward a particular kind of work that persists across years and circumstances, surviving every attempt to logic it away. The quiet certainty, available in the silence the noise keeps filling, about the direction your life is supposed to move in. This is the signal. It is not inspiration. It does not arrive dramatically. It is not loud. It is simply consistent, which is, when you learn to recognize it, a far more reliable quality than loud. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent years studying patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain involved in integrating emotional information into decision-making. What he found overturned a foundational assumption of rational thought. These patients were, by standard measures, cognitively intact. Their reasoning was logical. Their IQ was unaffected. But they had lost access to the somatic markers, the body-based emotional signals that normally accompany decision-making, the subtle feeling of rightness or wrongness that precedes and informs conscious choice. The result was not better, more rational decision-making. It was paralysis, or worse, a cascade of poor decisions made with perfect logical coherence. Without the signal, the reasoning faculty had nothing to orient itself toward. It could construct arguments with equal facility for any available option. It was a compass without a magnetic north. Damasio called this the somatic marker hypothesis, the idea that the body, and specifically its emotional signaling system, is not the enemy of good decision-making. It is a prerequisite for it. The signal is not opposed to rationality. It is what rationality is supposed to serve. You have been trained, in most educational and professional contexts, to distrust this, to override the felt sense with a logical argument, to treat the body's knowing as unreliable, emotional, soft. And in some specific contexts, where acute stress produces panic rather than clarity, that caution is valid. But as a general operating principle, the suppression of somatic signaling does not produce better thinking. It produces a man who can explain, with great precision and coherence, exactly why he keeps doing the thing he knows he shouldn't do. Here is the practical consequence of this, stated without decoration. Most people are not living their own signal. They are living someone else's map. The map was drawn early, by parents, by institutions, by the specific emotional environment of childhood where certain behaviors produced safety and others produced its absence. The map told you what to want, what to fear, what success looks like, what kind of person earns love, what ambitions are realistic for someone like you. You absorbed this map before you had the cognitive equipment to question it. And then you spent the next several decades navigating territory using a map that was drawn by someone else, for a terrain that may no longer exist, according to priorities that were never actually yours. The signal is what speaks when the map is set down. It is not comfortable, initially. There is a reason people prefer the map. The map has clear roads. It has legible destinations. It has the implicit endorsement of everyone who handed it to you. The signal, by contrast, is directional without being prescriptive. It tells you this way without always specifying the destination. It tells you not that without always offering an immediate alternative. Learning to follow it requires a tolerance for ambiguity that the map was specifically designed to eliminate. But the map will never take you somewhere that is genuinely yours. It will only take you somewhere that was already decided by people who may have loved you deeply and understood you incompletely. The man sitting in the coffee shop, laptop open, doing competent work in a career he chose because it was the reasonable option, he knows. He has known for 3 years. There is a specific feeling he gets at approximately 10:30 on Tuesday mornings when he is doing the particular kind of work that the reasonable career does not involve. A brief window of full engagement. A moment where the 37 open cognitive tabs collapse into one, where the background hum of mild dissatisfaction that he has been calling his personality goes quiet. He notices it. He enjoys it for 20 minutes. Then a notification arrives, or a meeting starts, or the moment passes in the ordinary way moments do, and he files it away under someday and returns to the map. He is not a victim. He is a man who has not yet learned to treat the signal as data rather than distraction. That distinction, signal as data, is what this chapter is actually about. The reason the signal keeps getting ignored is not that people are lazy or self-sabotaging in some dramatic psychological sense. It is that the signal is quiet and the old architecture is loud. The old architecture, that unconscious structure of beliefs and survival strategies assembled in response to early experience, has a vested interest in the familiar. Not because it is malicious, because it was built during a period when the unfamiliar was genuinely threatening and the familiar, however uncomfortable, was at least known. The old architecture learned to prefer a predictable pain over an unpredictable possibility. That was a reasonable adaptation for a 10-year-old navigating an environment he could not control. It is a catastrophic strategy for a 35-year-old with agency, resources, and options. The signal and the old architecture are in continuous competition for your behavioral output. Every time you know what you need to do and don't do it. Every time you sit down to work and open a browser tab that leads nowhere useful. Every time you commit to a direction and quietly abandon it by the weekend. You are not witnessing weakness. You are witnessing the old architecture winning a battle it has been winning for years, on terrain it knows better than you do, using weapons you haven't yet learned to name. Naming them is the beginning of changing the outcome. The practice, signal logging. For 14 consecutive days, keep a small notebook, physical, not digital, beside you during your work. Not for tasks or plans, only for this. Every time you notice a moment of full engagement, a problem that pulls you in without effort, a kind of thinking that makes time move differently, a feeling of this, write one sentence describing what you were doing. No analysis, just documentation. Equally, every time you notice the pull toward noise, the reach for the phone that happens before a conscious decision was made, the avoidance that disguises itself as preparation, write one sentence describing what you were about to do before you reached for it. What task? What thought? What demand? At the end of 14 days, you will have a rough map of your own signal, the consistent patterns of genuine engagement, and a rough map of the specific triggers that reliably produce avoidance. Most people, when they do this honestly, find that the noise reliably arrives at the same 2 or 3 points in their work. The moment before beginning something that matters, the moment a task becomes genuinely difficult, and the moment something they have done is about to be evaluated. These are not random. They are the exact coordinates where the old architecture exerts its strongest pressure. And knowing the coordinates is the first condition of not being ambushed by them. You are not fighting your attention. You are mapping a system. The distinction matters. There is a version of this work that feels like self-improvement, the optimized life, the tracked habits, the identity of someone who is becoming more efficient. That is not what this is. Efficiency is a byproduct. The signal is not pointing you toward productivity. It is pointing you toward coherence, toward the specific condition where what you do and what you are made of are no longer in quiet contradiction, where you stop spending energy on the maintenance of a gap between your public performance and your private knowledge. That coherence is what sovereignty actually feels like from the inside. Not power over circumstances, not immunity to difficulty, just the specific, durable quality of a life that is running on your own signal rather than borrowed noise. You have felt it in the moments that make Tuesday mornings at 10:30 worth remembering, in the silence after you have done something that required all of you, in the rare, brief instances when the noise stopped and something underneath it spoke clearly enough to hear. The question is no longer whether the signal exists. You know it does. The question is what you have been building in its place, and what it will cost to stop building it. That cost is the subject of Chapter 3. The signal does not get louder when you ignore it. It gets more expensive. Every month you spend navigating by the wrong map. The distance between where you are and where your signal has been pointing quietly accumulates interest. Not in guilt, in atrophy, the gradual narrowing of the window in which certain things are still possible. That narrowing is not a punishment. It is simple physics. And Chapter 3 will show you exactly what you have been building in the signal's place and why it has been so convincing. Chapter 3. What you call motivation is the problem. Motivation is not the solution. Motivation is the story you tell yourself to explain why you haven't started yet. That is not cynicism. It is a structural observation. Motivation, as most people understand and use it, is a feeling, a surge of readiness, clarity, and forward energy that arrives unpredictably, stays briefly, and disappears precisely when the work gets hard enough to require it. Building a life around motivation is like building a house around good weather. It works beautifully on the days it shows up. On the other days, you have no house. The remarkable thing is not that this system fails. The remarkable thing is how long intelligent people spend trying to generate better weather instead of building a roof. Here is the myth, stated in its most flattering form. If you find the right why, the right purpose, the right level of meaning in your work, the doing of it will cease to be a struggle. The motivated person doesn't fight resistance. They transcend it. Discipline becomes unnecessary when passion is sufficient. You won't need to force yourself to do what you love. Every part of that is wrong. And the wrongness is not benign. It is precisely constructed to keep you waiting. The research on intrinsic motivation, the genuine kind, the kind that comes from actual interest rather than external pressure, consistently shows that even people who deeply love their work experience resistance, avoidance, and the pull toward easier alternatives. A study following professional writers, artists, and scientists over multi-year periods found that the ones who produced the most were not the ones who reported the highest levels of enthusiasm for their work. They were the ones who showed up regardless of their enthusiasm, who had, somewhere along the way, decoupled the act of doing from the feeling of wanting to. They loved the work. They also understood that love is not a reliable engine. It is a reward for showing up, not a prerequisite for it. The feeling of motivation, when it comes, is real. It is also late. It arrives after the work has begun, not before. The surge of engagement you feel 20 minutes into a task you were dreading, that is motivation. It was not available before you started. It was produced by starting. Waiting for it was waiting for a fire to generate its own spark. The neuroscience here is precise enough to be useful. The brain's dopaminergic system, the circuitry most associated with motivation, drive, and reward, does not activate in anticipation of effort the way most people assume. It activates in response to progress, to the detection of forward movement toward a goal, which means the neurochemical experience of motivation is, at the mechanistic level, a consequence of action rather than its cause. You do not act because you are motivated. You become motivated because you acted. This is not a minor reframing. It inverts the entire sequence most people are waiting on. The man sitting at his desk at 7 a.m., waiting to feel ready before he opens the document. He is waiting for a neurological event that his nervous system is incapable of producing without the very stimulus he is withholding from it. He is asking the engine to warm up before he turns the key. The warmth requires the turning. The turning requires nothing except the decision to turn. That decision, made in the absence of readiness, in the presence of resistance, without the endorsement of feeling, is what this chapter is actually about. Picture this. The alarm goes off at 6 a.m. The room is cold in the specific way that makes the blanket feel like an argument. There is no surge of purpose. There is no clarity about the day ahead. There is just the alarm and the cold and the immediate, fluent negotiation. The old architecture opens. 5 more minutes. You were up late. You earned this. You'll be sharper after more sleep. One day won't matter. The negotiation is fast. It is practiced. It has won this particular argument hundreds of times. And it is not wrong. Exactly. 5 more minutes will not destroy anything. But it is also not about the 5 minutes. It is about which system is governing your behavior. It is about whether action requires the old architecture's approval before it can proceed. Every time it does, the threshold rises slightly. The approval becomes harder to grant. The conditions for beginning multiply, and the gap between intention and execution, already present, already uncomfortable, widens by exactly the width of 5 minutes, repeated across every morning, across every version of this negotiation, across every domain of your life where the old architecture has learned that it can open proceedings and usually win. The 5 minutes is not the problem. The negotiation is. What replaces motivation, then, is not willpower, that exhaustible, much mythologized resource that depletes across the day and fails precisely when most needed. What replaces it is something quieter and more durable, a committed structure. Not a routine, exactly. Routines can be broken and mourned and rebuilt and broken again. A committed structure is something prior to routine. It is the decision, made once and deliberately, that certain actions do not require a daily decision. They are not evaluated each morning against the current state of your enthusiasm. They are simply the shape your day takes. The negotiation is not reopened because it was settled in advance, at a time when you were not cold, not tired, not looking for a reason. The distinction matters because willpower operates on the model of continuous resistance, you against the pull, every day, grinding. A committed structure operates on the model of prior decision. The question was answered before the moment of weakness arrived. You are not fighting the cold room at 6 a.m. You already won that fight 2 weeks ago when you decided, in warmth and clarity, what kind of person you were going to be. This is how the signal becomes operational, not through inspiration, through pre-commitment. There is a man, a competitive athlete who transitioned into building a business in his mid-30s, who described the shift in terms so plain they almost sound too simple. He said, "I stopped asking myself if I felt like doing it. I started asking myself if I had decided to do it. Those are different questions, and they have different answers." He had felt, for most of his adult life, the same cycle familiar to almost everyone who reads books like this one. Motivation arrives, produces several excellent days, flags, collapses under a single hard week, requires rebuilding, arrives again diminished. He described it as trying to run on rocket fuel that kept running out. The shift was not motivational. It was architectural. He removed the feeling check from the equation entirely. Not because feelings stopped matching. They didn't. But because feelings became information rather than permission. The signal told him the direction. The committed structure handled the execution. The motivation showed up, when it showed up, as a bonus rather than a requirement. Within 14 months, his output had doubled. Not because he was working harder. Because he had stopped spending half his available energy negotiating with himself about whether to begin. Here is the psychological shadow this chapter is circling, because it is worth naming directly. The loyalty to motivation, the waiting for readiness, the search for the right conditions, the belief that genuine action should feel like it wants to happen, is not laziness dressed up. It is self-protection dressed up. If you only begin when you feel ready, you can never be said to have failed by beginning before you were capable. The unstarted project cannot be a bad project. The unwritten book cannot be a badly written book. The business not yet launched cannot be the business that failed. Motivation dependency is the most elegant procrastination system ever invented because it borrows the language of integrity. I want to do this right. I want to do it when I can give it everything, to perform the function of avoidance. It feels like high standards. It is the old architecture in a good suit. The signal has been pointing at this for a while. You already suspected it. This chapter just said it out loud. The practice, the zero negotiation protocol. Identify one action, one specific, concrete task that you have been waiting to feel ready for. It should be something you have intended to begin for at least 2 weeks and have not begun. Not a project. One action. Open the document, send the email, make the call, sit down at the desk. Set a time for tomorrow, specific, written down, non-negotiable. Not morning. 7:15 a.m., 2 p.m., an actual time. When that time arrives, you have 10 seconds. Not to feel ready, not to feel motivated. To begin the physical motion of beginning. Open the laptop, pick up the pen, put on the shoes. The old architecture will open negotiations. You do not attend the meeting. You are already moving. Do this for 5 consecutive days with the same action at the same time. You are not building a habit. You are demonstrating to the old architecture that its approval is no longer required for the process to proceed. That demonstration, repeated, is how the negotiation gradually stops being opened. The readiness you were waiting for? It arrives on day 3, sometimes day 4, never before you started. There is nothing wrong with wanting to feel motivated. The feeling is real, and when it comes, it is genuinely useful, a tailwind rather than a headwind. But a life structured around waiting for the tailwind is a life spent mostly standing still. The man who moves in all weather covers ground the weather watcher cannot imagine. Pressure builds a different engine, not the hot, bright burn of motivation. Something slower, colder, and far more reliable. Chapter 4 is where that engine gets its proper name, and where the emotions you have been trying to overcome turn out to be the exact material it runs on. Motivation is the feeling of beginning. Commitment is the decision that makes beginning inevitable. The man who understands that distinction stops waiting for a feeling and starts building a structure. And the structure, over time, generates something motivation never could: the specific, quiet confidence of a person who knows, not believes, knows, that they will do what they said they would do. That knowledge changes how you walk into a room. Chapter 4 will show you what it changes inside it. Chapter 4, Emotional Weather. You feel everything. That is not the problem. The problem is that you have been treating your feelings as forecasts, as reliable information about what is possible today, what you are capable of right now, whether the conditions are right to begin. And feelings are many things. Reliable forecasters are not among them. This chapter is not going to tell you to stop feeling. It is going to show you that the feelings were never the obstacle. The meaning you assigned them was. There is a distinction that most people spend their entire lives failing to make: the difference between having an emotion and being governed by one. These are not variations of the same experience. They are categorically different states, producing categorically different outcomes, and the gap between them is the gap between a person who occasionally acts well despite how they feel and a person who acts consistently regardless of how they feel. The first person is managing their emotions. The second has understood what emotions actually are. Emotions are not commands. They are not verdicts. They are not accurate assessments of your capability, your worth, or the viability of the thing you are trying to build. They are neurochemical events, fast, evolutionarily ancient, extraordinarily useful in the specific context they evolved to address, and dramatically overextended into contexts they were never designed for. Fear evolved to keep you alive in the presence of a predator. It was not designed to assess the risk profile of sending a cold email to a potential investor. The circuitry does not distinguish. The emotional experience is equally vivid either way. The information quality is not remotely equivalent. When you wake up feeling flat and conclude that today is not the day to do the thing that matters, you are taking navigational instructions from a system that cannot see the destination. It can only see the immediate terrain and report, with great conviction, on whether it feels safe. It almost never feels safe. That is not a malfunction. That is the design. The psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett spent decades challenging the conventional model of emotion, the idea that feelings are universal, hardwired responses that happen to us, that the brain detects fear the way the eye detects light. Her research, built across thousands of studies and brain imaging data, pointed towards something more unsettling and more useful. Emotions are not detected. They are constructed. The brain takes incoming physiological data, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, tightened chest, and interprets it through the lens of past experience, context, and prediction. It builds an emotional experience out of raw material, which means the same physiological state can be constructed as anxiety or excitement, dread or anticipation, depending on the interpretive frame the brain applies. This is not a metaphor. It is a mechanistic description of how your nervous system works. The man who feels his heart rate rise before a difficult conversation and labels it as anxiety, and therefore avoids the conversation, and the man who feels the same heart rate rise and labels it as readiness, and therefore has the conversation, are working with identical raw physiological material. The difference between them is not courage in any mystical sense. It is the learned habit of interpretation. One man has practiced reading the signal as a stop sign. The other has practiced reading it as an ignition. You have been practicing one of these for a long time. The practice is changeable, but first you have to see that it is a practice, not a fixed truth about your temperament. Here is the internal experience, stated in the language it actually arrives in. You sit down to do the thing. Immediately, the body registers the weight of it, the particular combination of importance and difficulty that activates something between tension and dread. The chest tightens slightly. The mind begins generating alternatives, each one more reasonable sounding than the last. I should check my email first. I should outline this before I write. I should eat something. I'm not in the right headspace. The alternatives multiply with impressive fluency because the old architecture is very good at what it does. It knows your vocabulary. It knows how to sound like wisdom rather than avoidance. And the feeling is real. The tension is not fabricated. You are not imagining the resistance. But the resistance is not evidence about the task. It is evidence about the proximity of the task to something that matters. Resistance scales with importance. The things you can begin easily, without friction, without the body's objection, those are rarely the things that will change anything. The presence of resistance is, in some structural sense, a confirmation that you are pointed in the right direction. You have been reading the weather report and concluding the flight should be canceled. The turbulence was the signal that you were at altitude. A woman in her late 40s, a surgeon, technically among the most disciplined professionals in any field, once described a pattern that she found both embarrassing and inexplicable given everything her professional life had required of her. Outside the operating room, she was functionally paralyzed by emotional states in a way she was not inside it. At work, feeling tired, anxious, or emotionally reactive had no bearing on her performance. She had been trained, across years of residency and practice, to treat her internal state as irrelevant to the technical demand. Her hands did not shake because she was sad. Her attention did not fragment because she was tired. The work had its own requirements and her feelings were, in that context, simply not part of the input. In her personal life, her writing, which she had been attempting on and off for 11 years, her exercise practice, her relationships, she waited for the feeling of readiness the way a surgical patient waits for anesthetic. She did not begin until the conditions felt right. The conditions rarely felt right. She had 2 operating systems and had never noticed they were different systems. The one she used at work had been built through years of practice and pressure. The one she used everywhere else had been built through years of deference to whatever she felt on a given morning. The insight, when it arrived, was not comfortable. She had assumed the surgical discipline was special, a professional exception that couldn't transfer. What she understood, slowly, was that it had never been exceptional. It had been trained, and anything trained can be extended. This is where the chapter earns its title. Weather is real. Rain is wet. Cold is cold. You do not argue with weather. You do not try to feel differently about it through willpower or positive thinking. You acknowledge it. It is raining. The temperature dropped. There is a storm forecast. And then you dress accordingly and proceed. This is the only relationship with your emotional life that actually works. Not suppression. Suppression is the attempt to pretend the weather isn't happening, which produces men who are rigid in the short term and brittle over time, who function under pressure until the pressure exceeds a threshold and then cannot function at all. Not indulgence. Indulgence is canceling every plan because the forecast is unfavorable, which produces men who are available and emotionally honest and consistently unable to build anything requiring sustained effort in adverse conditions. The third option is acknowledgement without governance. You feel the anxiety. You note it. There is anxiety present. You do not perform the feeling for an audience. You do not make decisions from inside it. You put on a coat and you walk into it. The anxiety does not disappear. It often intensifies briefly. This is normal and expected and worth knowing in advance so it does not surprise you into retreat. Then it shifts. not into confidence, necessarily, into something more useful, motion. The body in motion produces different neurochemistry than the body in hesitation. The feeling changes because the action changed it, not because you waited for it to change first. The practice, the weather report. For 1 week, before beginning any task you have been avoiding, write 3 words. Not a sentence. 3 words that name the emotional weather you are currently in. Flat, resistant, tired, or anxious, distracted, resentful, whatever is accurate. Then below it, write this single sentence. This is the weather. This is not the forecast for what is possible today. Then begin. This is not an affirmation. It is a cognitive interrupt, a deliberate insertion of a frame between the emotional state and the behavioral response. It does not change what you feel. It changes what the feeling is allowed to determine. Over time, the interrupt becomes faster, then automatic, then unnecessary, because the nervous system has learned through repetition that the emotional weather and the behavioral output are different variables. The governor of one is not the governor of the other. You are not building emotional toughness in the brittle sense. You are building emotional literacy, the capacity to read the weather accurately, dress for it appropriately, and move through it without waiting for it to clear. The clearing, when it happens, will surprise you. Not because the feelings went away, because they stopped being the most important thing in the room. There is something that happens when a man consistently acts in the presence of his feelings rather than in their absence. Something the people around him begin to notice before he does. A quality of presence that is different from confidence as most people perform it. Louder, more assertive, more concerned with how it lands. This is quieter, stiller. The stillness of something that has been under pressure and did not break. That quality is not manufactured. It cannot be performed. It is the residue of 1,000 small moments where the emotional weather was real and the action happened anyway. Where the signal was followed not because it felt good to follow it, but because it was true, and because the committed structure made the alternative. Negotiating with the old architecture in the cold room at 6 a.m., no longer available as an option. It accumulates, slowly, without announcement. And then one day someone sits across from you and cannot quite articulate what is different about you. And you understand that what they are sensing is the absence of the negotiation. The silence where the internal argument used to be. That silence is the beginning of what Chapter 5 will name as something more structural, more deliberate, and more powerful than most people have understood it to be. Emotions are the weather. You are not the weather. You are the one who decides whether the weather runs the schedule. The man who learns this stops being at the mercy of his own internal forecast. He becomes, gradually and without drama, the kind of person whose behavior is legible to himself, consistent enough to trust, clear enough to build on. Chapter 5 is about what that consistency looks like when it is practiced outwardly, in silence, over time. About what it costs and what it builds and why the noise has been filling the space it belongs in. Chapter 5. The Discipline of Silence. The most dangerous thing you can do is tell people what you are building before you have built it. Not because they will steal it, not because they will sabotage you, though sometimes they will, but because the telling releases something that the building requires. A specific internal pressure that is, it turns out, not a side effect of serious work. It is the fuel. There is a mechanism in the brain's reward circuitry that most people have accidentally learned to exploit against themselves. When you announce a goal, when you tell someone about the business you are starting, the body you are building, the book you are writing, the social acknowledgement of that announcement produces immeasurable release of dopamine. A real one, neurochemically indistinguishable, in its immediate quality, from the dopamine produced by actually making progress on the goal. The brain, receiving the reward signal, partially updates its model of the world. The thing has been acknowledged, the identity has been claimed, the social reality has shifted. The drive to pursue the goal, which runs, in part, on the tension between where you are and where you want to be, is slightly reduced by the announcement that you are already the kind of person who is headed there. You got the reward before you did the work, and the work, stripped of part of its motivational fuel, becomes harder to begin. Researchers at NYU studying this phenomenon found that people who kept their intentions private were significantly more likely to follow through on them than people who announced them publicly. The public announcers reported feeling more committed. They were less so. The feeling of commitment had been partially satisfied by its performance. This is the structural reason silence is not merely a stoic preference or a personality style. It is a performance-relevant variable. The man who disappears into his work and reappears with results has not been lucky or antisocial. He has been, whether consciously or not, protecting the pressure differential that makes sustained effort possible. But silence, as this chapter means it, is not only about keeping goals private. That is the surface layer, useful, concrete, and worth practicing. Beneath it is something more complete. The discipline of silence is the practice of removing yourself from the economy of opinion. Most people live, without recognizing it, inside a continuous exchange market where actions are evaluated against their social return. Not cynically, not consciously, but structurally. The background process running beneath every decision, every post, every conversation, every choice about how to spend a Tuesday. What will this signal? What will this cost me in others' estimation? What does this make me look like? Who will approve? Who will question? Will I need to explain this? This is not vanity. It is a survival mechanism with deep evolutionary roots. Human beings are social animals who survived through group membership, and group membership historically required legibility, being understandable, predictable, and approvable enough to the group that you were not expelled from it. The anxiety about others' opinions is not a weakness. It is an ancient and well-tested piece of hardware. It is also, in the context of building anything that requires genuine originality, quietly catastrophic. Because the opinion economy runs on the currency of the familiar. What gets approved is what is already understood. What is already understood is what already exists. The thing you are actually trying to build, the version of your work, your business, your life that is genuinely yours rather than a competent reproduction of something already legible, cannot be fully explained while it is being built. It can only be protected while it is being built. And the protection it needs is not secrecy. It is silence, the withdrawal of the work from the judgment economy until it is complete enough to stand on its own. The painter who shows the unfinished canvas too early does not get useful feedback. He gets the judgment of people who can only see what is missing. Worse, he begins to see it through their eyes. The painting that was moving in a particular direction, following the signal of its own internal logic, now has additional voices in it. The voices of people who were not there when it started, who do not understand what it is becoming, and who are pattern matching it against things they have already seen. The painting does not always recover. The painter does not always notice what changed. What changed was the silence. The discipline of silence operates in 3 registers, and each requires a different kind of practice. The first is external silence, the one most people associate with the concept. Not announcing, not broadcasting, not performing the process of becoming. This is the most visible practice and the easiest to begin. Simply stop narrating your intentions to anyone who doesn't need to know them to help execute them. The gym is not a story until the body is the story. The business is not a brand until the business is operating. The new direction is not an identity until the new direction has been walked for long enough to hold weight. Until then, it is a declaration. And declarations, as we have established, are the brain's favorite way of getting the reward without paying the price. The second register is relational silence, the practice of selective inaccessibility. Not coldness, not withdrawal from genuine connection. The specific discipline of not being perpetually available for other people's urgency. The phone face down during work hours. The willingness to not respond immediately. The ability to be in a room with someone and have a part of yourself that is not available for their inspection. This is not distance, it is interiority. The quality of having an inside life that is not continuously externalized. Most people have lost this so gradually they do not know it is missing. They feel vaguely hollow without stimulation and vaguely anxious without an audience, and they have called this sensitivity. What it is, in many cases, is the atrophy of the capacity to be alone with oneself without finding it intolerable. The third register is the deepest, internal silence, the practice of not narrating your own experience to yourself in real time. The continuous internal monologue that comments on, judges, contextualizes, and performs your life to an imagined audience inside your own head. The voice that says, I am doing well today, and I am falling behind, and this is not working, and I think I am finally getting this right. The voice that is always, at some level, delivering a verdict on the proceedings. That voice is not your signal. It is your commentary. And commentary, however sophisticated, is not action. It is the internalized version of the opinion economy, relocated inside your skull. The man who quiets the commentary does not become empty. He becomes available to the actual texture of what is in front of him, to the signal beneath the narration, to the specific quality of attention that produces work no commentary could have generated. Silence, practiced in these three registers, does something to the quality of presence that is difficult to describe and immediately recognizable to others. There is a specific experience of sitting across from a person who is genuinely internal, who does not need you to validate their experience, who is not performing their competence or their struggle, who has something they are not telling you and are entirely comfortable not telling you. The experience of that presence is not cold. It is gravitational. People describe it as confidence, usually. That is not quite right. Confident people often need you to see their confidence. This is something prior to confidence, the simple, structural quality of a person who is not running the opinion economy in the background, who has nothing to prove because they are not, at this moment, in the business of proving. That quality is produced by the discipline, not by the personality, which means it is available to anyone willing to practice what generates it. 6 months into a period he described as the most productive of his life, a man who had spent years in the ambient noise of a heavily networked industry did something his colleagues found baffling. He stopped being findable, not entirely, not from the people whose input genuinely mattered to the work, but from the continuous low-grade social availability that had, he realized, been consuming something he could not name and could only notice in its absence. He stopped posting. He stopped explaining his direction to people who asked. He arrived at meetings having done work that nobody had seen him do. He left conversations earlier. He was harder to read. He became, in the words of someone who had known him for years, different in a way I can't locate. He could locate it. The noise had dropped far enough that the signal had room. The pressure that had been continuously venting through social performance had been held long enough to become force. The work, in that silence, had found a quality it had been reaching for in the noise and never quite achieved. He had not become a different person. He had finally become himself, in the specific way that self can only emerge when it is no longer being continuously shaped by its audience. The practice, the silence perimeter. Define one domain of your current work or building, one project, one direction, one thing in progress, and place it behind a silence perimeter for 30 days. This means you do not discuss it with anyone who is not operationally required to know about it. You do not post about it. You do not mention it in conversation as a way of claiming the identity of someone who is working on it. You do not narrate its progress, even positively, even to people who would celebrate it. You simply work on it, in the dark, alone with the thing and whatever it is becoming. At the end of 30 days, you will have 2 things the announcement would have cost you. The work itself, at whatever stage it has genuinely reached, not the stage you claimed, the actual stage, and the specific, non-transferable confidence of a person who knows what they built because they were the only one watching while they built it. That confidence does not require an audience to maintain. This is what makes it structurally different from every other kind you have tried to generate. Write nothing about it. Tell no one. Just notice what the silence does to the quality of the work, and what the quality of the work does to your understanding of what you are capable of. Silence is not absence. It is compression, the deliberate concentration of energy that has been dispersing into performance, narration, and the opinion economy. What the noise was spending, the silence is saving. And saved pressure, held long enough, does not stay still. It finds direction. It finds force. Chapter 6 is where that force turns inward, into the specific, unfamiliar, and ultimately irreplaceable experience of being alone with yourself long enough to find out who is actually there. Silence is not what you do when you have nothing to say. It is what you do when you have decided to build something worth saying. The man who has practiced this long enough stops needing to announce himself. He walks into a room and the room adjusts. Not because he performed anything, because he brought the accumulated pressure of work done in private, conviction tested without an audience, and a self that was not assembled from other people's feedback. Chapter 6 will show you what that self finds when the last external voice goes quiet, and there is only the room, the work, and whatever has been waiting in the space the noise used to occupy. Chapter 6: The Laboratory of Solitude. The first time you sit alone with no input and no task and no audience, you will meet someone you were not expecting. Not your best self, not your worst self, just the unedited version, the one that exists before the performance begins, before the social calibration runs, before you have spent even 30 seconds arranging yourself for someone else's perception. That meeting is uncomfortable in a way that is difficult to prepare for, because the discomfort does not come from what you find. It comes from how unfamiliar the finding feels. You have been in your own company your entire life. You have almost never been alone with yourself. These are not the same thing. There is a difference between solitude and loneliness that most people collapse into a single experience, which is why most people avoid both with equal energy. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted disconnection, the absence of others when their presence is needed. Solitude is something prior to social need entirely. It is the condition of being sufficiently complete in yourself that the absence of others is not experienced as deprivation, but as space. Space in which a particular kind of thinking, feeling, and self-recognition becomes possible that cannot occur in the presence of an audience, even a benevolent one, even a quiet one. The psychologist Donald Winnicott, writing about child development in the 1950s, identified what he considered one of the most important capacities a person could develop: the ability to be alone. Not the ability to tolerate isolation, which is passive and often painful. The active, cultivated capacity to be present with oneself without anxiety. He noted, with characteristic precision, that this capacity is paradoxically developed in the presence of another. A reliable, non-intrusive presence that makes no demands and requires no performance, in whose company the child learns that their interior world is safe to inhabit. Later, the internalized memory of that presence makes genuine solitude possible. Most adults have never fully developed this capacity, not because they lack the opportunity, but because the culture they grew up in and the digital environment they currently inhabit treats inner silence as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be cultivated. Discomfort is a notification to be cleared. Boredom is a bug in the system. The interior world, unoccupied and unnarrated, is treated as a void rather than a laboratory. What gets lost in that confusion is incalculable. The laboratory metaphor is not decorative. It is precise. A laboratory is a controlled environment, stripped of variables, cleared of interference, designed to allow the thing being studied to reveal its actual properties rather than the properties produced by its interaction with everything else. You cannot see what a substance is made of while it is reacting to 50 other substances simultaneously. You remove the other substances. You apply specific conditions. You observe what remains. Solitude is that removal. What remains, when the social performance is suspended and the noise is off and the opinion economy is closed for the day, is the actual composition of you, your genuine interests, your real fears, the specific shape of your signal, the contours of the old architecture that are invisible when you are busy reacting to the world but become legible when the world stops providing material to react to. This is why solitude is not merely restful. It is diagnostic. And why the findings, when you are honest about them, are sometimes the most useful information you have encountered in years. What most people find in the first days of genuine solitude is not peace. It is noise, internal noise, the kind that was always there beneath the external variety, now audible without competition. The unfinished thoughts that have been interrupted 1,000 times and never resolved. The low-grade anxieties that the noise was managing rather than addressing. The assessments you have been avoiding making because making them would require acting on them. The 2 a.m. voice, but now at 2 p.m. in daylight, with nowhere to redirect it. This is the phase most people mistake for evidence that solitude is not for them. That they are, in some constitutional sense, people who need stimulation, social, digital, environmental. The discomfort confirms the belief that the interior is not safe to inhabit, that there is something wrong with the quality of their own company. There is nothing wrong. The discomfort is the laboratory doing its job. The unresolved thoughts surfacing are not pathology. They are backlog, material that has been accumulating behind the dam of continuous distraction, finally moving. The anxiety is not generated by the solitude. It was stored there, waiting for conditions quiet enough to be processed. The solitude did not create it. The solitude made it visible. Visible is not comfortable. Visible is necessary. There is a specific afternoon I return to when I think about what solitude actually teaches. A Thursday. A rented room in a city where I knew no one, by design. No meeting scheduled. No phone signal worth using. A notebook on the table and the specific, slightly vertiginous freedom of a day with no social demand on it whatsoever. For the first 2 hours, the internal noise was loud enough to be almost physical. The compulsion to check, to connect, to produce something legible to someone. The hands reaching for a phone that wasn't performing its usual function. The mind generating tasks, plans, problems to solve. Anything with enough structure to prevent the confrontation with the unstructured. Then something shifted. Not dramatically. Not into peace, exactly. Into a kind of settling. The way sediment settles when water stops moving. And in that settling, beneath the noise and the task generation and the performance instinct, something was there that I had been too busy to hear. Not a revelation. Not an answer. A direction. The specific, quiet orientation of the signal pointing at something I had been navigating around for months. Not because I didn't know it was there, but because knowing it would require changing something I wasn't ready to change. The solitude hadn't given me the answer. It had removed enough interference that I could no longer convincingly pretend I didn't already have it. That is what the laboratory does. It does not generate the signal. It creates the conditions under which the signal becomes undeniable. The people who have developed a genuine practice of solitude share a quality that is consistently noticeable and consistently misidentified. It gets called confidence or groundedness or presence. Sometimes people call it arrogance because it can look like indifference to approval. What it actually is simpler than any of those names. They know who they are when no one is watching. This sounds like a small thing. It is the foundational thing. Because identity that has only been tested in public, assembled from performance, shaped by feedback, maintained by legibility to others, is identity that requires continuous external validation to remain stable. Remove the audience, and it wobbles. Threaten the perception, and it panics. The person built entirely in public has no private interior to retreat to when the public exterior comes under pressure. The person who has sat alone long enough, honestly enough, to know what they actually think, actually want, actually fear, that person carries something inside that external conditions cannot touch. Not because they are invulnerable, because their center of gravity is located inside them, not distributed across other people's opinions of them. That is sovereignty in its most structural form, not the performance of not caring. The genuine, developed, practiced condition of being located inside yourself. The practice, the weekly laboratory. Once per week, same day, same time, non-negotiable, create a 2-hour block of complete solitude. Not meditation. Not journaling unless something surfaces that requires it. Not productive solitude dressed up as contemplation. Actual unstructured time, alone, with no input and no output requirement. For the first month, this will feel like a waste. The old architecture will generate an impressive list of more important uses for 2 hours. The discomfort will be real and will arrive punctually. You do not negotiate with it. You sit with it. In that sitting, notice 3 things. What surfaces without invitation, what you find yourself wanting to avoid thinking about, and what direction, however vague, however premature, your attention keeps returning to when given no external instruction. You do not need to act on any of this immediately. You are not problem-solving. You are developing the capacity to be present to your own interior without flinching. The foundational skill that every other practice in this book is, in some sense, building toward. The laboratory is where the signal gets clear enough to follow. The following is what Chapter 7 is about. But the following requires first knowing what you are following and what has been running in its place, quietly, since before you had the language to name it. The quality of your solitude determines the quality of your direction. A man who never sits alone long enough to hear his own signal clearly will always be partially navigating by borrowed orientation. Other people's urgency, the culture's ambient priorities, the old architecture's preference for the familiar. He will move, sometimes quickly, sometimes impressively. But the movement will have a quality of drift beneath its purposefulness. A directionlessness that doesn't look like directionlessness because it is always busy. The man who has sat in the laboratory long enough to know his own composition moves differently. Not faster, necessarily. With more friction, often, because the signal points at things that are harder than the comfortable alternatives. But with the specific, irreplaceable quality of a person who knows why he is moving in the direction he is moving, because he found the direction himself, in the silence, when there was nothing left to distract him from it. Chapter 7 is where we examine what was built in that silence's place, the structure that has been running the show before this work began, the one you have been calling your personality, your nature, your limitations. The old architecture. It is time to look at the blueprints. Solitude is not where you go to escape the pressure. It is where the pressure becomes precise enough to use. The man who has been in the laboratory knows what he is made of. Chapter 7 will show you what you are made from, and why the difference between those 2 things is the distance between the life you are living and the one your signal has been describing. Chapter 7. The Old Architecture. You did not choose the first version of yourself. It was built for you, mostly without your knowledge, by people who were themselves operating from structures they did not choose either. This is not blame. It is blueprint reading. And until you read the blueprint, you will keep renovating the surface of a building whose load-bearing walls are arranged in ways that make certain rooms permanently inaccessible, certain heights structurally impossible, certain views permanently obstructed, not because you lack the materials, but because the foundation was laid before you arrived to supervise the construction. The old architecture is not your enemy. It kept you alive. It is simply no longer the right building for the life your signal is trying to inhabit. Here is how the old architecture gets built. You arrive in the world with a nervous system calibrated for attachment, biologically dependent on the proximity and responsiveness of caregivers in a way that is not optional, not cultural, not philosophical. It is survival infrastructure. The infant who fails to secure attachment does not develop suboptimally. In the most literal sense, it does not develop. The bond is not a preference. It is oxygen. And so, with extraordinary speed and precision, you begin learning the rules of the specific attachment environment you were born into. Not consciously. You do not have the cognitive equipment for conscious learning yet. You learn the way water learns the shape of the vessel, by filling every available space, taking the form that the container requires, moving toward what flows and away from what doesn't. You learn what behaviors produce warmth and which produce withdrawal, what kind of need is met and what kind is quietly discouraged, what version of you is welcome and what version creates friction in the room. You learn, in other words, to be the self that survives here, not the self that thrives, the self that survives. These are not the same project, and the distinction will cost you decades if you do not eventually notice it. By the time you are old enough to ask questions about who you are, the answer has largely been pre-assembled. The beliefs about your capability, your worth, your right to want what you want, the realistic scope of what is available to someone like you, are already load-bearing. They feel like observations. They are, in almost every case, constructions, built from the specific materials of your specific early environment by a version of you who was doing the only reasonable thing available, learning to fit. The psychologist John Bowlby, whose work on attachment fundamentally reorganized developmental psychology, described what he called internal working models, the unconscious cognitive and emotional schemas that the child develops based on early relational experience, and which then function as templates for every subsequent relationship, including the one with oneself. These models are not memories. They are operating systems. They run beneath conscious thought, shaping perception, interpretation, and expectation in ways that feel like reality rather than learned pattern. A child who learned that love was conditional on performance does not, as an adult, consciously believe that love is conditional on performance. He experiences it as simply obvious that he must earn his place in every room, that approval requires continuous maintenance, that stopping, resting, failing, being ordinary, carries a risk he cannot quite articulate but can always feel. He does not recognize this as the old architecture speaking. He experiences it as his own psychology, as the way things are. The architecture is invisible precisely because it was built before the observer existed who could see it. This is the psychological shadow underneath every chapter of this book, stated now with the full precision the reader has earned, the secret loyalty to limitation. The unconscious belief, installed early and maintained silently, that staying within the architecture's permitted dimensions is safer than building something larger, because something larger would require becoming someone the early environment never validated, and the nervous system, trained on that environment's rules, still treats that expansion as exposure to a danger that has not existed for 20 years. The signal keeps pointing beyond the architecture. The old architecture keeps redirecting the pointing back toward the familiar, and the man caught between them experiences the result as inconsistency, as self-sabotage, as the baffling gap between what he knows he is capable of and what he consistently produces. It is not a character flaw. It is a structural conflict. And structural conflicts require structural solutions, not more motivation, not harder trying, not a better morning routine applied to an unchanged foundation. The old architecture operates through three primary mechanisms, each sophisticated enough to be mistaken for something else entirely. The first is identity foreclosure, the premature solidification of a self-concept that was formed in response to early conditions rather than genuine self-exploration. The man who decided at 19, based on a specific combination of family expectation and early success, that he was a particular kind of person, practical, not creative, analytical, not intuitive, built for execution, not vision, and has been living inside that decision ever since, long after the conditions that generated it have ceased to apply. The decision feels like self-knowledge. It is a survival adaptation that outlived its context. The second mechanism is threat pattern generalization, the extension of the nervous system's threat response from the specific contexts where it was appropriate to every context that carries structural similarity. The man who learned, in a high-criticism early environment, that visibility was dangerous, that being seen clearly meant being judged and found wanting, carries that learning into every subsequent context where visibility is required. The business pitch, the creative work shown to others, the honest conversation about what he actually wants. The nervous system pattern matches the structure, visibility plus potential judgment, and activates the same protective response regardless of the actual risk level. He experiences this as anxiety or resistance, or the vague feeling that it is not quite the right time to be seen doing this particular thing. The third mechanism is the most subtle, comfort calibration, the unconscious setting of a ceiling on well-being, success, and self-expression that corresponds to the highest level of these things that the early environment permitted or modeled. Beyond that ceiling, the old architecture becomes actively uncomfortable, not because the expansion is dangerous, but because it is unfamiliar. And the nervous system, lacking a reference point for how it feels to be safe at this new altitude, treats the absence of familiarity as the presence of threat. The man who sabotages his own success in the specific moment when it exceeds his internal model's permitted range is not self-destructive in any conscious sense. He is following the architecture's building codes. The codes simply need to be revised. Here is what it feels like from the inside. At 2 a.m., in the specific language the old architecture uses when it speaks. You don't actually deserve this. People like you don't end up here. When they find out what you're really like, this falls apart. Better not to get too far out. The fall is harder from height. Better to stay legible. Better to stay within what you know you can defend. This voice is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as fear. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like realism. It sounds, often, like the most clear-eyed assessment in the room, because the old architecture is not stupid. It is brilliant, in the specific way that a system optimized for one environment is brilliant, perfectly adapted to conditions that no longer exist, generating predictions that were once accurate and are now only accurate enough to be believed. You have been believing it, not because you are naive, but because the voice is old enough and practiced enough to have become indistinguishable from your own thinking. The architecture speaks in first person. It says, I believe this. I cannot do that. I am not the kind of person who, and you, hearing the first person, have been assuming the speaker is you. It is not you. It is the building. A man in his early 40s, successful by most measures, chronically dissatisfied by his own, came to understand his old architecture through an experience so ordinary it almost doesn't merit description. He was in a meeting. Someone suggested he lead a larger initiative, a visible one that would require him to operate at a scale he had not previously operated at. His response was immediate and fluent. He listed, with apparent reasonableness, 3 practical obstacles. The meeting moved on. That night, examining the 3 obstacles, he found they were real but not decisive. They were the kind of obstacles that the version of him who wanted to do the thing would have found manageable. They were not, he realized, the reason he had declined. They were the reason he had given for declining. The actual reason was something prior, a flash, lasting perhaps a quarter of a second, of the specific quality of exposure that the larger role would have required. Being seen operating at a scale that exceeded what he privately believed he had the right to occupy. The old architecture had spoken in the language of practical reasoning. He had translated it fluently and delivered it as his own considered position. Nobody in the room had known. He had barely known himself. The quarter-second flash was the tell. He had learned, eventually, to catch it, the brief involuntary contraction that preceded the reasonable explanation. Once he could see the contraction, the explanation lost its authority. It was still available. It was no longer believed. The practice, blueprint reading. Take a domain of your life where there is a persistent gap, a consistent pattern of intending and not executing, reaching a certain level and not exceeding it, wanting something and reliably not pursuing it past a specific point. You know which domain. You have known for some time. Ask, in writing, these 3 questions. Answer them honestly, not the answer that sounds reasonable, the answer that is true. What would I have to become to close this gap? What does the version of me that closes this gap look like? And is that someone my early environment would have recognized as safe, acceptable, appropriate? What is the specific feeling, not thought, feeling that arises when I imagine fully becoming that person? The feeling in the 3rd answer is the old architecture's building code. It is the emotional marker of the ceiling. You do not need to demolish it immediately. The architecture was built over years and does not come down in a session. But naming the code, locating the feeling, separating the voice from your own thinking, this is the structural work. Everything else in this book has been preparing you for this question. The question is this limit mine or was it installed before I had the capacity to refuse it? Most limits, examined honestly, turn out to be the latter. The old architecture is not your character. It is not your destiny. It is not even, in the most important sense, your past. It is your past's model of what your future was allowed to be. And that model was built by a version of you who was doing the reasonable, necessary, intelligent thing given the tools and the environment available at the time. You have different tools now. The environment has changed. The question the old architecture was built to answer, how do I stay safe in this specific early world, is no longer the operative question. The operative question, the one your signal has been trying to get to for years, is different. Who am I when safety is no longer the only priority? Chapter 8 is the answer to that question, not in theory, but in the documented reality of a man who asked it, paid the price the asking requires, and walked out of the architecture into something that could not have been predicted from inside it. The old architecture is not what you are. It is what you learned to be when what you are wasn't yet safe enough to show. The distance between those two things is not a failure. It is the territory this entire book has been mapping. Chapter 8 will show you, through one man's specific and unembellished story, what crossing that territory actually looks like. Not the highlight reel version, but the version where the walls come down slowly, the cost is real, and what is built in the space they occupied is exactly as worth it as your signal has always insisted it would be. Chapter 8, The Funeral. He didn't announce it. There was no post, no declaration, no dramatic pivot story told to an audience who hadn't asked. There was just a Tuesday in November when Marcus, 38 years old, 14 years into a career in corporate finance that had made him comfortable, respected, and quietly hollowed out, did not send the email he was supposed to send, closed his laptop at 2 p.m., and sat for a long time in his office with the door shut, looking at nothing in particular. He had been in the building for long enough to know every corridor. He had stopped, sometime in the last year, being able to remember why he had entered it. This chapter is about what happened next, not the version where the decision is made and the new life begins immediately, lit from within by purpose and momentum. The actual version, which is slower, messier, more ambiguous, and more real than the curated transformation story that gets posted 18 months later when the dust has settled and the narrative has been cleaned up for public consumption. The actual version is the only useful one, because the curated version produces admiration. The actual version produces recognition, the specific, clarifying recognition that the path is difficult in particular, documentable ways, and that the difficulty is not a sign of having chosen wrong. It is the sign of having chosen at all. Marcus had known for approximately 4 years that something fundamental was misaligned. He had not been passive in that time. He had read, thought, discussed, considered, planned, and on 3 separate occasions drafted emails of resignation that he had not sent. Each draft was better than the last. Each unsent email was evidence of a version of himself he could articulate and could not yet become. The gap was not informational. He knew what he wanted to do, had known, if he was honest, since before the finance career began, since a period in his mid-20s when he had been building something of his own and had stepped away from it for reasons that had seemed practical at the time and now seemed, in retrospect, like the old architecture making its most consequential move. He had wanted security. He had wanted legibility, to be doing something that the people in his early life would recognize as success. He had wanted, underneath all of it, to not be exposed as someone who had tried something ambitious and failed at it. The finance career had provided all 3. It had not provided the thing underneath the 3. The signal had been noting this discrepancy for 4 years. He had been responding with increasingly sophisticated versions of soon. The thing nobody tells you about the decision to fundamentally change direction is that the decision itself is not the hard part. The hard part is the period between the decision and the new identity being real, the gap in which the old self has been relinquished but the new self has not yet been established, and you are standing in the space between them with no floor beneath you, no ceiling above you, and every person in your life asking, with genuine or poorly concealed concern, whether you were sure about this. Marcus left his position in January. By March, he was questioning everything, not the direction, which remained clear, but his right to move in it. The old architecture, deprived of the structural validation it had been deriving from the career's legibility, ran its most sophisticated operation. It produced, with great fluency, a continuous stream of evidence that he had been foolish, that the people who had quietly raised eyebrows had been right, that the gap between who he had been in the career and who he was trying to become was too wide to cross without a net he did not have. He sat with that every morning. In his kitchen, coffee getting cold while he looked at the work he was trying to build, feeling the specific vertigo of a man who has stepped off a known ledge before the new ground is visible. This is the funeral the chapter title refers to, not a dramatic ceremony, a protracted, uncomfortable, often solitary process of grieving a version of yourself that had real value, that had genuinely served, that had been genuinely competent, that people had genuinely respected, and that you have chosen to release anyway, not because it was worthless, but because it was not yours. The grief is real. It should be honored. The people who skip the grief, who treat the shedding of the old self as an entirely triumphant act, tend to find the old self resurfacing 6 months later through the back door. You bury what deserves to be buried. You do it honestly. You do not pretend the thing had no value. By May, 4 months out, something had shifted. Not dramatically. The work was not yet generating the financial stability the career had provided. The new identity was not yet legible to most people in his life. The old architecture was still present, still vocal, still arriving reliably every morning with its portfolio of reasonable concerns. But beneath it, something was operating that had not been operating before. A quality of engagement with the daily work that was. He searched for the right word and kept arriving at the same one. Clean. Not easy. Clean. The resistance was still there. The difficulty was real. But the background hum of misalignment, the low-grade noise of a life running on the wrong signal, had gone quiet. He was building something that was actually his. The pressure of that building was considerable. It was pressure he was generating, pointing in a direction he had chosen, toward an outcome that was genuinely uncertain. He described it, months later, as the difference between being exhausted by something that was draining him and being exhausted by something that was building him. The tiredness felt different. The morning felt different. He woke up in it rather than behind it. That distinction, exhaustion that drains versus exhaustion that builds, is one of the most reliable signals that the old architecture has been replaced by something more genuinely yours. Not the absence of difficulty, the quality of the difficulty. Whether it is costing you something or whether it is creating something. Both feel hard. Only one leaves you more at the end of a hard day than you were at the beginning. Here is what the funeral costs. Stated plainly, because the curated version always understates this and leaves people feeling they are failing when the bill arrives. It costs relationships, not all of them, but the ones that were structured around the person you used to be. The friendships that existed inside the old identity's context and have no natural extension into the new one. This is not drama. It is not betrayal in either direction. It is the simple, quiet grief of two people who grew in directions that no longer intersect, discovering they have less to say to each other than they used to. Some of these losses are more painful than leaving the career was. It costs time, more than the optimistic planning assumed. The new architecture does not assemble at the speed the old one was dismantled. Building always takes longer than clearing. This is not failure. It is construction physics. It costs certainty, the specific, underrated comfort of knowing what you are doing, and what tomorrow looks like. The old architecture, whatever its limitations, was legible. The new one, in its early stages, is not. There is a period where you cannot give a clean answer to what do you do, without a paragraph of explanation that sounds, even to your own ears, like it is still being figured out. This period is longer than comfortable. It is also, in retrospect, among the most important periods of the building, because it is the period where the new identity is being established through actual practice rather than claimed through announcement. It costs the protection of smallness. The safety of not being fully visible, not being fully invested, not being the person who put everything in and might have to account for whether it was enough. This is the deepest cost. Because smallness, for all its suffocation, is genuinely safe in the specific way the old architecture was designed to prioritize. It cannot fail publicly, cannot be judged fully, cannot be measured against its highest aspiration and found short. The funeral asks you to give up that protection, to be fully in, fully visible, fully accountable for the direction your signal has been pointing. To no longer have the cover of "I could do this if I tried," and instead be standing in the reality of "I am trying, and this is where I am." That exposure is what the old architecture was built to prevent. It is also, it turns out, the only condition under which anything genuinely yours can be built. Marcus, 2 years out, described his life with a specificity that was itself evidence of the transformation. Not the sweeping claim, "I am happier, I am more fulfilled," but the granular, physical, daily reality. He described waking up and knowing what the day was for. He described the quality of tiredness at the end of a day of building his own thing versus the quality of tiredness after a day of managing someone else's priorities. He described, with some embarrassment and then without it, a conversation with someone from his previous professional life who had asked how he was doing, and his surprise at the plainness of his own answer. "Really well, actually." No performance in it. No subtext of convincing. Just the flat, undefended truth. He had attended the funeral. He had sat with the grief honestly. He had remained in the uncomfortable in-between longer than he wanted to. And what had emerged was not the person he had planned to become. Plans made from inside the old architecture are always partial, always limited by what that architecture believes is available to someone like you. What emerged was something he had not been able to plan for, because he had not previously had access to the building materials. He had not found himself. He had built himself, from the signal outward, in the silence, under pressure, through the grief of the things relinquished. The building was not finished. It would not be finished. But it was unmistakably his. The practice, the honest inventory. Not a journaling exercise, an accounting. Write, in 2 columns, with full honesty. What I am holding that was never mine, the identities, expectations, directions, and self-definitions that came from the old architecture's survival requirements rather than the signal's genuine orientation. Be specific, not abstract. Name the actual things. What I keep reaching for that the old architecture keeps redirecting. The specific, consistent pulls your signal produces that have been meeting the same internal resistance, the same reasonable explanations for delay, the same comfort with someday. You do not need to act on this inventory today. You need to see it clearly. Because the gap between those 2 columns, between what you are holding that was never yours and what you keep being redirected away from, is the architectural drawing of the person you have not yet permitted yourself to become. The funeral begins with knowing what needs to be buried. The inventory is the knowing. The old architecture was built for survival. The new one is built for sovereignty. The difference is not comfort. The new one is often less comfortable, at least initially, than the old one was. The difference is authorship. Whose priorities are running the building? Whose signal is being followed? Whose life is actually being lived? That shift, from a life assembled by survival requirements to a life built by genuine choice, does not happen in a moment of insight. It happens in the accumulated daily decisions of a person who has attended the funeral, sat with the grief, and chosen to build anyway. Who has raised the standard not because they want to impress anyone, but because the old standard was set by someone who was trying to survive, and survival is no longer the only available aspiration. Chapter 9 is about that standard, about what it means to hold yourself to something that was chosen rather than installed, about why most people's standards are secretly calibrated not to what they are capable of, but to what they believe they are permitted. The funeral is not the end of something. It is the first honest act of construction. What you bury in it was never your foundation. It was your ceiling, the one installed before you had the height to question it. Chapter 9 will show you what becomes possible when the ceiling comes down and the standard is set, for the first time, by someone who is no longer primarily concerned with staying safe inside a building that was designed for someone else. Chapter 9. The Standard. Most people are not failing to meet their standards. They are succeeding at meeting standards that were never designed to take them anywhere worth going. This is the reframe that changes everything. Not a motivational one, not a push toward higher achievement in the generic sense, but a structural observation about where standards actually come from and who, in most cases, actually set them. Because the standard you are currently holding yourself to was not chosen. It was inherited. And inherited standards have a specific, identifiable quality once you learn to recognize it. They are calibrated to the ceiling of what the people who installed them believed was appropriate for someone like you. In their specific world, at their specific moment, with their specific limitations as the unexamined frame of reference. You have been running at their ceiling and calling it your ambition. There is a concept in psychology called reference group theory, the idea that human beings evaluate their performance, worth, and aspiration not against an absolute standard, but against the implicit standard of the group they identify with. We set our expectations, our effort levels, and our definitions of success by comparison to the people we consider our peers, the visible range of what people like us achieve, endure, and permit themselves to want. This process is largely unconscious. You do not sit down and consciously decide that your ambition should be calibrated to the median outcome of your social environment. You simply absorb it, through continuous proximity, as the implicit definition of what is reasonable, what is realistic, what is permitted without becoming strange, without exceeding the group's comfort with your visibility, without triggering the particular social friction that comes from wanting something conspicuously larger than what the people around you have decided to want. The reference group sets the standard. The standard sets the ceiling. And the ceiling, mistaken for the sky, produces a specific kind of life, competent, reasonable, and quietly located several floors below the signal's actual orientation. Raising the standard is not, as it is usually framed, a matter of wanting more. Wanting more is easy. Wanting more without revising the underlying belief about what you are permitted to have is just a longer gap between intention and outcome, with more frustration running through it. The actual work of raising the standard is belief surgery. Specifically, locating the places where the standard is not a chosen aspiration but an inherited permission, and revising the permission structure at its root rather than papering over it with ambition. This requires honesty about a question most people avoid with remarkable efficiency. What is the highest outcome I genuinely, privately believe is available to someone like me? Not the answer you would give publicly, the one that sounds appropriately ambitious without being embarrassing. The actual private answer. The ceiling you do not consciously acknowledge because acknowledging it would require either accepting it or fighting it, and both feel harder than the comfortable ambiguity of I just haven't gotten there yet. That private ceiling is the standard the old architecture installed. It is not yours. It was set by people operating from their own limitations, who loved you or didn't, who understood you partially or not at all, who projected onto you the range of what they had seen people like them achieve, and that range was specific to their world, their era, their reference group, and their particular configuration of permission and constraint. You inherited a range. You do not have to live inside it. Here is what a genuinely chosen standard feels like, as distinct from an inherited one. It makes you slightly uncomfortable when you state it plainly, not because it is unrealistic, though it may be ambitious, but because claiming it requires occupying a self-concept that the old architecture has not yet normalized. There is a fraction of a second, when you say it out loud or write it down, where the nervous system registers something between exposure and vertigo. The old architecture is noting the distance between the standard you just claimed and the range it considers permitted. That discomfort is not a signal to lower the standard. It is confirmation that the standard is yours rather than borrowed. Borrowed standards feel comfortable because they fit within the already normalized range. Genuine standards feel slightly too large for the container you currently occupy because they are designed for the version of you that the signal has been describing, not the version the old architecture has been producing. The discomfort is the gap. The gap is the work. The work is the point. A woman who had spent 11 years building a business to a specific size, respectable, profitable, stable, came to understand something about her own standard through a conversation she had not expected to be significant. A peer, someone she considered roughly equivalent in capability and experience, described a goal she was working toward that was an order of magnitude larger than anything this woman had explicitly aimed for. Not better resourced, not more talented, not operating in a more favorable market, simply aiming at a different ceiling. The woman's first response was the familiar architecture of dismissal. She's being unrealistic. That's not how this market works, she'll learn. The dismissal came fast and fluent. It always does when someone else's standard threatens to make yours visible by contrast. But the dismissal was followed, that evening, by something more honest. A question she sat with for a long time. If she is not more capable than me, and I do not believe she is, then the difference between her ceiling and mine is not capability. It is permission. That question cracked something open. Not immediately, not dramatically. The crack was quiet and internal and produced no visible change for several weeks. Then it began producing changes that were very visible indeed, not because the woman had suddenly found new capability, but because she had stopped applying the old permission structure to the capability she had always had. The business, 18 months later, had exceeded the peer's stated goal. The woman described it not as an achievement, exactly, more as a correction. The closing of a gap between what she had been doing and what she had always been capable of, separated by nothing more substantive than a borrowed ceiling she had mistaken for a law of physics. The standard operates at 3 levels, and all 3 need revision for the change to be structural rather than cosmetic. The first is the performance standard, what you hold yourself to in the daily execution of your work. Most people, operating from inherited standards, have a performance floor that is acceptably above average and a ceiling that stops well short of their actual capacity. The floor is high enough to maintain the appearance of competence. The ceiling is low enough to stay within the permission range. The result is work that is competent, rarely remarkable, and produced by a person operating at perhaps 60% of available capacity, not from laziness, but from a standard that was never designed to elicit anything more. The second level is the recovery standard, how you respond to failure, setback, and the inevitable distance between intention and outcome. The inherited standard typically produces one of 2 failure responses, both of which are more concerned with managing the social meaning of failure than with extracting its actual utility. Either excessive self-criticism that performs rigor while actually producing shame and contraction, or rapid minimization that protects the ego while forfeiting the learning. Neither is what the signal requires. The chosen standard treats failure as data, specific, usable, stripped of moral weight, and applies it immediately to the next iteration. Not because the person does not feel the sting of failure, but because they have revised the standard for what failure means. It means the last attempt was insufficient. It does not mean the person is. The third level is the identity standard, the most foundational and the most resistant to casual revision. This is the standard for who you permit yourself to be, the version of yourself you consider plausible, the altitude at which you believe your presence is legitimate. This standard is the one set earliest, reinforced most continuously, and disguised most completely as objective self-assessment. Revising it does not happen through ambition or effort. It happens through the accumulated practice of acting, repeatedly, as the person you are becoming rather than the person you were installed to be. The identity standard changes through behavior, not through belief, because belief follows evidence, and evidence is produced by action, and action in the direction of the chosen standard is how the nervous system slowly normalizes the new range as permitted. There is a specific quality to the man who has revised his standard at all 3 levels. It is not loudness. It is not the performance of high expectations or the aggressive posturing of someone who has read about standards and is now enforcing them as a personality trait. It is quieter than that, more internal. He simply does not accept the same things from himself that he used to accept, not from moral rigidity, from a revised model of what is available to him. The standard has changed. The changed standard changes what counts as sufficient. What counts as sufficient changes what he will tolerate in his own performance, his own recovery, his own self-concept. The change is cumulative and self-reinforcing. Each iteration of meeting the chosen standard updates the identity's model of what it is capable of, which raises the felt ceiling slightly, which makes the next chosen standard slightly more available. This is how sovereignty accumulates, not in dramatic gestures, in the compression of daily standards, held without announcement, revised upward through consistent evidence, maintained in the silence where no one is watching, and the only standard that matters is the one you set for yourself when there was no external reason to set it high. The practice, the standard audit. In 3 specific areas of your life, your work, your physical existence, your closest relationships, write down the current operating standard, not the aspiration, the actual standard you are currently applying to your own behavior, your own effort, your own acceptable minimum. Then ask, for each, was this standard chosen or inherited? And if inherited, from whom? And are their limitations still my limits? Then write the standard you would set if you believed, genuinely, privately, not for performance, that the range of what is available to you is larger than your reference group modeled. Write what holding yourself to that standard would require you to do differently tomorrow morning. Not eventually, tomorrow morning. One specific, concrete, behavioral difference that the higher standard produces in the next 24 hours. That specific behavioral difference is the standard becoming real, not as aspiration, as structure, not as a belief about yourself, but as evidence you are producing, evidence that revises the belief from the outside in, which is the only direction revision actually holds. The standard is not a measurement. It is a declaration of what you consider yourself worth building toward, which is, finally, a question only you can answer, not the version of you that was assembled from the old architecture's permission structure, not the version calibrated to the reference group's comfortable range, the version that has sat in the laboratory, attended the funeral, heard the signal clearly enough to follow it, and decided, in full knowledge of what it costs and full acceptance of what it asks, that the ceiling was never the sky. Compression is what takes that decision and makes it operational, not as a single choice, but as the daily, specific, architectural narrowing of everything that disperses the standard before it can be practiced. Chapter 10 is that architecture, the practical construction of the conditions under which the chosen standard can be met, the signal can be followed, and the person the old architecture was protecting you from becoming can finally, quietly, take up residence. The standard you inherited kept you safe. The standard you choose will make you real. The man who sets his own standard and holds it privately, without performance, without negotiation, that man is no longer running the old architecture's operating system. He has installed something new. Chapter 10 is about how to build the environment that makes that new system durable, not dependent on motivation, not vulnerable to emotional weather, not reversible the moment the pressure exceeds a certain threshold. Compression is the engineering. This is where it gets specific. Chapter 10, Compression. Scattered force is not force. It is motion. The distinction matters more than most people's productivity systems acknowledge. Motion is what happens when energy is applied without direction. The busy person, the perpetually occupied person, the person who ends every day having done many things and moved none of the things that matter. Force is what happens when the same energy is concentrated, directed, and sustained in a single vector long enough to displace something that was not moving before. You do not need more energy. You need fewer directions for it to leak into. Compression is the deliberate narrowing of your attention, your environment, your commitments, and your social surface area into something concentrated enough to generate actual force. Not the aggressive, white-knuckled narrowing of someone trying to manufacture discipline through sheer restriction. The architectural narrowing of someone who understands that the same amount of water that spreads harmlessly across a flat surface will cut through stone if it is channeled into a single point under pressure. You are the water. The question has always been the channel. Most people spend their lives in the spreading configuration, available to every demand, responsive to every stimulus, present in every direction simultaneously, and puzzled by the absence of the depth their effort should be producing. They are not lazy. They are dispersed. And dispersion, at the level most modern lives operate, is so normalized that the alternative, genuine compression, looks antisocial, obsessive, or somehow excessive. Which is a neat trick the noise has pulled. It has made the condition that produces nothing feel like balance, and the condition that produces everything feel like pathology. The neuroscience of sustained attention reveals something that most productivity culture gets exactly backwards. The assumption is that attention is a fixed resource that depletes through use and requires regular diffusion, breaks, variety, stimulation to be replenished. And this is partially true in the narrow context of deliberate recovery. But the research on what cognitive scientists call deep work capacity suggests something more consequential. The ability to sustain focused attention on a single cognitively demanding task is not fixed. It is trained, and it is trained in one direction only, through practice. Every time you sustain focus past the point of discomfort, past the moment the old architecture starts generating alternative tasks, past the natural pull towards something easier and more immediately rewarding, you are extending the range of what your attention is capable of. Every time you fragment before that point, you are contracting it. The sessions that felt hardest were not the ones depleting your capacity. They were the ones building it. The interruptions you permitted were not rest. They were regression. This is why the man who has been working in a state of continuous partial attention for 3 years cannot suddenly sustain 4 hours of deep work through willpower alone. The capacity has been trained in the wrong direction. It requires patient, incremental, deliberate retraining, starting at whatever duration is currently sustainable and extending it, session by session, week by week, in the specific way that any physical capacity is built, consistently, gradually, and with respect for the reality that the adaptation happens between the sessions, not during them. Compression operates across 4 domains simultaneously. Partial compression, applying it in one domain while leaving the others dispersed, produces partial results, which most people interpret as evidence that compression doesn't work, rather than evidence that they compressed one tributary while leaving the main channels open. The first domain is temporal compression, the structure of your time. Not a schedule in the conventional sense, a list of tasks assigned to hours. A hierarchy of protected time, in which the work that matters most to your signal is assigned the hours in which your cognitive capacity is highest, surrounded by conditions that prevent intrusion, and held as non-negotiable against every competing demand that does not constitute an actual emergency. Most people give their best hours to the most urgent task, which is rarely the most important one. The inbox gets the morning. The signal gets whatever is left by 3 p.m., which is usually not enough. The inversion of this, protecting the signal's work with the ferocity most people reserve for their busiest meetings, is the first structural act of compression. It does not require more time. It requires a different assignment of the time already there. The second domain is environmental compression, the physical and digital conditions in which the work happens. The research on environmental design and behavior is consistent and substantial. Behavior is profoundly shaped by environment, often more than by intention. The person who keeps their phone on their desk will check it, regardless of how committed they are to not checking it. The person who works in a space designed for distraction will be distracted, regardless of how motivated they feel on a given morning. The environment is not neutral. It is either designed for compression or it is designed against it. And most people are working in environments designed by default, which means designed by the noise, for the noise, optimized for accessibility rather than depth. Compression requires environment design. the deliberate construction of the physical and digital conditions that make the desired behavior the path of least resistance, and the undesired behavior require active effort, not willpower applied to a hostile environment. Architecture adjusted to make the signals work easier than the noise. The third domain is relational compression, the narrowing of social availability that Chapter 5 introduced as silence, extended here into its full structural implication. The number of people with genuine access to your attention, your time, and your decision-making is not a social metric. It is a cognitive one. Every relationship that runs on the model of continuous availability, the expectation of immediate response, the implicit obligation to be present to someone else's needs and timelines on demand, is a compression leak. Not because the relationship lacks value, but because the cognitive overhead of managing continuous social availability is substantial, invisible, and directly competitive with the sustained attention that compression requires. This does not mean fewer relationships. It means relationships structured differently, on terms that preserve rather than consume the interior resource. The difference between a deep, infrequent conversation with someone who matters and a continuous, ambient, low-grade social maintenance relationship is not just preferential. It is architectural. One compresses, one disperses. Both can be genuine. Only one is compatible with the work the signal requires. The fourth domain is commitment compression, the ruthless narrowing of what you are currently trying to build to the number of things that can genuinely be built simultaneously given your actual resources. Most people are running 3 to 7 parallel initiatives, each receiving insufficient resource to achieve genuine momentum, each providing enough progress to justify continued investment, none receiving enough concentrated force to break through to the level where the signal's work actually lives. This is not a time management problem. It is an honesty problem. The man running 7 parallel initiatives is not ambitious. He is avoiding the commitment compression that genuine ambition requires, because committing fully to one direction means accepting that the others are, for now, not happening. And not happening feels, to the old architecture, indistinguishable from failing. The 7 parallel initiatives are the maintenance of optionality dressed as productivity. They protect against the exposure of full commitment. They ensure that no single failure can be total. They also ensure that no single success can be complete. There is a specific quality to the day of a man operating in genuine compression that is almost impossible to describe accurately to someone who has not experienced it, and immediately recognizable to someone who has. It is not the frantic productivity of the overwhelmed. It is not the forced focus of someone white-knuckling their way through a resistant morning. It is something quieter, a quality of absorption that makes the usual distinction between work and rest partially dissolve, because the work is aligned closely enough with the signal that the energy it requires and the energy it produces are not entirely separate transactions. The day has a spine. There is a clear center of gravity. The decisions that used to consume disproportionate cognitive resources, what to do next, whether this is the right direction, whether to check the thing before returning to the work, either do not arise or are answered before they generate friction. The committed structure has pre-answered them. The environment has pre-answered others. What remains is the work itself and the specific quality of tiredness at the end of a day in which the work was actually done, not approximated, not gestured toward, not partially completed between 20 interruptions, but actually done, is unlike any other tiredness. It is the tiredness that builds. The tiredness Marcus found on the other side of his funeral. The tiredness that feels, even at its most complete, like something deposited rather than something lost. The practice, the compression audit. Map your current week honestly across the 4 domains. Not the week you intend to have, the week you actually have. 4. Temporal compression. Where are your highest cognitive hours currently going? And is that where your signal's work lives? 4. Environmental compression. Identify the 3 environmental factors most reliably associated with the moments you lose compression, the specific triggers, digital or physical, that reliably produce fragmentation. Design one structural change that removes or reduces each. not willpower applied to their presence. Architecture adjusted to reduce their access. For relational compression, identify one relationship currently structured around continuous availability that could be restructured around intentional depth without genuine loss to the relationship's value. Have the conversation or make the adjustment that restructures it. For commitment compression, list everything you are currently trying to build or maintain. Identify the one that is closest to your signal's actual orientation. Now ask, honestly, is this receiving enough concentrated resource to generate genuine momentum, or is it one of 7 things receiving 1/7 of the force it requires? The answer to that last question is where the compression actually begins. Not in the elimination of everything else, not yet, not necessarily. In the honest acknowledgement of the dispersion. You cannot compress what you cannot see. The audit makes it visible. The visibility makes the choice available. The choice, made honestly and held in the silence, is the compression beginning. The man who compresses is not the man who does less. He is the man who stops doing everything partially and starts doing the essential thing completely. The distinction is not philosophical. It is the difference between a life that contains the signal and a life that is built by it. Everything in this book has been building toward this. Not a set of techniques, but a structural transformation from a life dispersed across noise, inherited standards, borrowed maps, and the old architecture's permission structure to a life compressed around the signal's genuine orientation, maintained in silence, held to a chosen standard. Built through the accumulated daily practice of acting as the person you are becoming rather than the person you were installed to be. Chapter 11 is where this transformation reveals its deepest truth, the one that reframes every chapter before it. The war was never with the world. It was never with the noise, or the old architecture, or the people who set inadequate standards or built environments hostile to compression. It was always internal. It was always here. And knowing that change is not just what you fight, but what winning looks like. Compression is not the elimination of everything that matters less. It is the protection of everything that matters most. The man who has learned to compress has stopped asking the world to be quieter so he can hear the signal. He has built the conditions under which the signal is audible regardless of the world's noise level. That man is sovereign in the only sense that holds under pressure. Not because nothing can touch him, but because what touches him no longer governs him. Chapter 11 will name what he has actually been building, across every chapter, in the silence and the standard, in the compression, in the funeral, in the laboratory. It has a name. It has always had a name. And hearing it said plainly, at this stage of the book, will feel less like a revelation than a recognition. Chapter 11, The Quiet War. The enemy was never out there. You knew this. Some part of you has known it the entire time. Through every chapter, every practice, every moment of recognition in which the book held up the mirror and you saw yourself looking back with uncomfortable clarity. The noise was internal before it was external. The old architecture was always yours to examine. The standard was always yours to set. The signal was always yours to follow. The war was never with the world. It was with the version of yourself that found the world's chaos more comfortable than your own clarity, that found the noise more familiar than the signal, that found borrowed standards safer than chosen ones, that kept the funeral postponed because the grief was real and the outcome was uncertain, and the old architecture had 100 reasonable explanations for why now was not quite the right time. That is the war. It has always been the war, and it is quiet. Which is why most people never name it, never fight it, never win it. They fight louder enemies because louder enemies are easier to locate and more socially legible to defeat. They fight circumstances, markets, competitors, relationships, their upbringing, the economy, the timing, the luck they didn't have. All of these are real. None of them are the war. Here is what the quiet war actually is. It is the daily, ongoing, never fully resolved contest between the part of you that has heard the signal clearly and the part of you that finds reasons to not follow it. between the version of you that knows what needs to happen and the version that generates, with extraordinary fluency and apparent reasonableness, the case for why today is not the day. Between the self the old architecture assembled in the name of survival and the self the signal has been describing in the name of something more. It is quiet because it happens below the threshold of drama. It happens in the 30 seconds between the alarm and the decision, in the pause before opening the document, in the moment someone offers you a version of yourself you have not yet claimed, a larger role, a harder question, a more visible expression of what you are actually capable of, and you feel the quarter-second contraction before the reasonable explanation arrives. The war is fought in those moments, not in grand gestures, not in declarations, in the accumulated weight of small decisions, made mostly without an audience, that determine whether the signal or the old architecture is running the day. Most people never identify the war because they are too busy with the engagements. The engagements are the specific daily conflicts, with motivation, with consistency, with the morning, with the work, with the relationships that pull in directions the signal is not pointing. These are real, and they require real effort. But they are not the war. They are the war's local expressions. And fighting the engagements without naming the war is like treating symptoms without knowing the diagnosis. You can win individual battles indefinitely while losing the thing that matters. The philosopher William James, writing at the turn of the 20th century, before the vocabulary of neuroscience was available to him, but with a precision that neuroscience has since confirmed, described what he called the will to believe. Not wishful thinking. The active, deliberate choice to orient toward a particular version of reality before the evidence for it is complete. His argument was that certain realities do not become available until they are acted upon, that the evidence for them cannot precede the commitment to them, because the commitment is what generates the conditions under which the evidence is produced. He was describing, in the language available to him, the mechanism of the quiet war. The man who waits for evidence that he is capable before he acts as though he is capable will wait indefinitely. The capability is demonstrated by the action, not confirmed before it. The signal points at something that does not yet exist as evidence. The commitment to following the signal is what produces the evidence. The evidence revises the identity. The revised identity enables the next commitment. The cycle compounds, slowly at first, imperceptibly, then with a momentum that begins to look from the outside like talent or luck or natural aptitude, and is, from the inside, the accumulated residue of 10,000 quiet war victories that nobody witnessed and nobody recorded. This is sovereignty in its most complete form, not the performance of it. The structural reality of a life that has been built, decision by decision, from the signal outward, in compression, in silence, at a chosen standard, through the grief of the funeral and the clarity of the laboratory and the honest accounting of the blueprint. Winning the quiet war does not look like what most people imagine when they imagine a transformed life. It does not arrive as a moment. There is no morning when you wake up and the old architecture is gone. The signal is perfectly clear, the standard is effortlessly met, and the compression requires no maintenance. The man who has been winning this war for 3 years still has mornings when the alarm sounds, and the cold room makes its argument, and the old architecture opens proceedings. He still has days when the noise is louder than usual, when the emotional weather is severe enough to make the coat feel insufficient, when the signal is present but the following of it requires more than he had easily available. The difference is not the absence of the war. It is the absence of the uncertainty about who is going to win it. He knows, not from confidence in the blustering sense, from evidence, the specific, accumulated, personal evidence of a man who has fought this particular war in this particular internal terrain enough times to know how it ends when he shows up for it. The old architecture still speaks. He no longer mistakes its voice for his own. The noise still pulls. He no longer mistakes its direction for the signals. The emotional weather still arrives. He dresses for it and moves. This knowing is not passive. It is the active, practiced, continuously renewed knowledge of a person who has chosen, repeatedly, in the dark, without an audience, to act from the signal rather than from the fear dressed as logic, the wound dressed as personality, the limitation called identity. That is what winning the quiet war produces. Not invulnerability, not the absence of difficulty, the specific, durable, self-generated certainty of a person who no longer needs the war to be over to move forward, who has learned to move forward precisely because the war is ongoing, because the ongoing nature of it is what keeps the signal sharp, the standard honest, and the compression real. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in Letters to a Young Man navigating his own version of this exact terrain, wrote something that has survived more than a century because it says the thing exactly, without decoration. I would like to beg you to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Not the answers, the questions, the unresolved, the ongoing, the not yet complete. This is not passive. It is the active, difficult, mature practice of living inside the quiet war without requiring it to be over before you begin to move. Most people are waiting for the resolution. For the moment the internal conflict ends, the doubt clears, the path becomes certain enough to walk without hesitation. That moment does not arrive before the walking. It arrives, sometimes, as a consequence of it. And sometimes it does not arrive as a moment at all, only as a gradual, cumulative reduction in the friction between what you know and what you do. That reduction is enough. It is more than enough. It is, in the end, what the signal was always pointing at, not a destination, not a fixed arrival, but the specific quality of a life in which the direction and the living of it are finally, honestly, yours. There is a man, you have met him in different forms across every chapter of this book, who has done this work. Not perfectly, not without regression, not without mornings that contradicted everything he understood and weeks that required returning to practices he thought he had outgrown. He has attended the funeral and then discovered, months later, that there was more to bury. He has raised his standard and then found the old architecture had simply relocated its ceiling one floor higher. He has compressed and then watched the compression leak in new directions he hadn't anticipated. He is not finished. He will not be finished. But he is no longer lost inside the war without knowing he is fighting it. He is no longer mistaking the old architecture's voice for his own judgment. He is no longer outrunning the signal with noise and calling the running a life. He knows where the center of gravity is. He knows how to return to it when he drifts. He knows, most importantly, that the returning is not failure. It is the practice. It has always been the practice. The practice is the point. He walks differently than he used to, not with the performed confidence of a man trying to project authority, with the quiet, rooted, undramatic presence of a man who knows where he is standing and why he chose to stand there. People notice. They cannot always say what they are noticing. They say grounded or certain or simply different, and none of these names it fully because the thing they are sensing is not a quality that was added. It is the quality that emerges when what was blocking it has been, imperfectly and patiently, cleared. That clearing is what every chapter of this book has been doing. Not building something new onto the surface. Removing what was installed before you could consent to its installation. Making room for what was always underneath. The signal, quiet and consistent and patient, waiting not for you to become something else, but for you to stop arguing with what you already are. The practice, name the war. Not a written exercise, an act of recognition. Identify the specific form your quiet war takes, not the generic version, the personal, named, particular version. The exact place where the signal and the old architecture meet most reliably, most consequentially, and most often. The domain, the recurring moment, the specific form the quarter-second contraction takes before the reasonable explanation arrives. Name it precisely, in your own language, without clinical distance, without self-protection, without the hedge that makes the naming feel safer but less true. Then ask, once, without expecting an immediate answer, what would today look like if I fought this war with full knowledge of what it is, instead of fighting its symptoms without knowing their source? You do not need to win today. You need to fight today knowing what you are fighting. The knowing changes the quality of the engagement. The quality of the engagement, sustained over time, changes the outcome. The changed outcome changes the man. That is the whole mechanism. It has always been the whole mechanism. Everything else was scaffolding for this. The quiet war does not end. That is not a consolation. It is the design. A war that ends leaves a man who no longer knows how to fight. And the fighting, it turns out, is not only the means to the signal. For the man who has learned to fight consciously, honestly, and without self-deception, it is part of the life itself. The ongoing, daily, never-boring engagement with the question of who is governing this moment. The accumulated answer to that question, across a lifetime of moments, is what a life actually is. Not the biography, not the outcomes, the quality of the internal engagement, the honesty of the fighting, the consistency of choosing the signal over the fear, the chosen standard over the inherited one, the compression over the dispersion, the silence over the performance, the funeral over the preservation. Choosing these things again and again, in the dark, without an audience, for no reason other than that the signal said this way and you decided to trust it. That trust, sustained under pressure, is sovereignty. And sovereignty, the conclusion will show you, is not where this ends. It is where you begin. The war was never with the world. It was with the version of you that found your own limitations more familiar than your own potential. Familiarity is not the same as truth, and the man who has learned to distinguish between them has already won something that cannot be taken back, regardless of what happens next, regardless of what the world does with what he builds, regardless of whether the outcomes justify the standard he chose to hold himself to. He has won the only war that was ever his to fight. Everything from here is territory. Chapter 11 has named the war. The conclusion will witness the man who fought it. Conclusion: what you are now. The man who stops trying to control everything around him becomes the most controlled person in the room. You remember that sentence. You read it at the beginning, in a different life, or what feels like one, though the calendar may show only days or weeks. At the start, it sounded like a riddle, something to hold skeptically while the book made its case. Now it sounds like a description of something you have been becoming, quietly, in the hours you spent with these pages and in the space between them where the real work happened. The ground shifted beneath you. You may not have noticed it moving. That is how the deepest shifts work, not as earthquakes, but as tides. You look up one day and the shoreline is different, and you realize it has been moving for longer than you knew. Let me name what happened here, without ceremony and without exaggeration. You came to this book with a gap you could feel but not fully see, between what you were doing and what you knew you were capable of, between the life assembled by the old architecture and the life your signal had been quietly describing. You could feel the noise. You could feel the pull of borrowed standards and inherited permission structures. You could feel, at 2 a.m. in the particular silence that honest people cannot outrun, that something fundamental was misaligned between the life you were living and the life that was actually yours. That feeling was not a problem. It was the signal. And the signal, this book has argued from its first page to this one, does not get louder when you ignore it. It gets more expensive. You stopped paying that particular price the moment you decided to look directly at the mechanism instead of managing its symptoms. The psychological shadow underneath every chapter of this book, the thing this work was actually dismantling beneath its stated subject, was never about discipline or consistency or building better habits. It was about the secret loyalty to limitation, the unconscious agreement, installed before you had the capacity to refuse it, that the range of what is available to someone like you is bounded by the ceilings of the people who built your first world. That expansion was exposure, that being fully seen, fully invested, fully the author of a life aimed at something genuinely yours, that this was too much, too visible, too far from the permitted range, too risky to survive if it failed. You can name it now, not as a diagnosis, as a thing you looked at directly and decided was no longer the operating authority. That is not a small thing. Most people never do it. not because they lack the intelligence. As this book has noted, intelligence is extraordinarily useful for maintaining the architecture's cover story, but because looking directly at the structure requires accepting that the structure was never your character, was never your nature, was never the truth about what you are, was only what you learned to be when what you are wasn't yet safe enough to show. You showed it anyway, in the daily decisions that nobody witnessed, in the silence that compressed the noise into something usable, in the laboratory where you sat long enough to hear your own signal over the architecture's arguments, in the funeral where you buried, with genuine grief, the version of yourself that had real value and was not yours, in the standard you set when no one was watching and the old architecture asked why you were bothering. You bothered. That is the record. The vocabulary you carry out of this book is not a set of concepts. It is a toolkit, the specific instruments of a particular kind of internal literacy that you now own in a way that cannot be taken back by a bad week or a regression or the old architecture making its arguments on a cold Tuesday morning. Sovereignty. You know now that this was never about power over circumstances. It is the condition of being ungovernable by your own unexamined fear. You have practiced it. You understand it from the inside. It is not a destination. It is a daily practice of returning to the signal when you have drifted, without drama, without excessive self-judgment, with the practiced ease of someone who knows the way back because they have walked it enough times. The signal, you can hear it more clearly than you could at the start. Not perfectly, not without interference, but the noise is less convincing than it used to be, and the gap between what you feel pulled toward and what you actually do has narrowed. That narrowing is the signal becoming operational. It will continue narrowing as long as you keep doing the work. Noise, you can see it now. You see it when you reach for the phone before you know you are reaching. You see it when the reasonable explanation arrives a quarter second after the contraction. You see it in the performance of self-improvement that is sometimes the most sophisticated noise there is. Seeing it does not make you immune to it. It makes it impossible to be fully deceived by it. That is enough. That is more than enough. Compression. You understand that scattered force is motion, not progress. You have felt the difference between a day spent dispersed and a day spent compressed. The difference is not subtle. You will not mistake one for the other again, even when the dispersion is comfortable and the compression requires choosing it actively against the path of least resistance. The old architecture. You have read the blueprints. You know the load-bearing walls from the decorative ones. You know which ceilings were installed by others and which constraints are actually yours. You will encounter the architecture again. You are encountering it now, probably, in some form, and you will recognize it faster than you used to. The recognition is the work. The recognition is what makes the next choice different from the last one. This book asked something genuine of you, not the performance of self-improvement. The actual work, the sitting in the laboratory when it was uncomfortable, the attending of the funeral when the grief was real, the raising of the standard when the old architecture had 1,000 reasonable arguments for the current one, the compression when dispersion was easier, the silence when the noise offered relief. That work is hard, not in the way that is celebrated, not the visible, documented, shareable difficulty that earns recognition. In the private, unwitnessed, often unglamorous way of a person doing the only work that actually matters, the work of becoming, daily, more genuinely themselves. I want to acknowledge the difficulty honestly, without softening it. Most people will not do this work, not because they read this book and found it unconvincing, because they will not read this far, not because they lack the capacity, because the capacity, as every chapter has argued, was never in question, but because looking honestly at the mechanism, sitting with the grief of the funeral, setting the standard when no one is enforcing it, fighting the quiet war with full knowledge of what it is, these things require a specific kind of courage that is not celebrated and not rewarded and not visible from the outside. You did it anyway. There is one truth that makes everything in this book irreversible. One reframe that, once understood at the level below thought, cannot be unfitted from the way you read your own behavior. The limitation was never the truth about what you are. It was the architecture of what you learned to be. And learned things can be unlearned, not by knowing differently, but by acting differently, repeatedly, until the new action becomes the new architecture. You have begun that construction. The foundation is laid in the choices you made while reading this, in the practices you attempted, in the recognitions that landed before you could defend against them. The building will take longer than you want. It will require returning to the work on days when the emotional weather argues against it. It will require the compression when the dispersion is easier, the silence when the noise offers comfort, the chosen standard when the inherited one would suffice. It will be worth it, not as a promise, as a structural consequence of building something that is genuinely yours, because a life built from the signal outward, however imperfect and ongoing and incomplete, has a quality that a life assembled from borrowed material cannot generate: the specific, quiet, daily experience of being the author of what is happening. Not the controller of outcomes, the author of direction, the author of effort, the author of the standard by which you hold yourself, the author of the silence in which you built, and the compression in which you focused, and the chosen standard in which you worked, and the funeral in which you released what needed releasing so that what you actually are could finally have the space it required. I am grateful, not in the performative way of someone closing a transaction, but in the specific way of someone who has sat across from enough people doing this work to know what it costs and what it builds. Most people carry the gap their entire lives. They feel it. They manage it. They develop sophisticated systems for not looking at it directly. They are not failures. They are people who never had the specific combination of honesty and structure and willingness to be uncomfortable that this work requires. You had it. You brought it here. You used it. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the hardest and most important thing a person can do. Not climbing the external mountain, impressive as that is, but descending into the internal one, into the architecture, into the laboratory, into the funeral, into the quiet war, into the places where the signal lives and the fear has been keeping the lights off. You turned the lights on. In that dark room, you found what was always there, not what you needed to become, but what you had been protected from being. The distance between those two things is where a life happens. You have closed some of that distance. More remains. That is not a shortcoming. That is the design. You are standing, right now, at the edge of something real, not a transformed life completed and delivered. The beginning of one, built on a foundation that is, for the first time, structurally yours. Set at a standard you chose, running on a signal you can hear, maintained in a silence that is no longer empty but full, compressed toward what matters, freed, imperfectly and permanently, from the secret loyalty to limitation that was always the real constraint. The work continues. The war continues. The building continues. Go do it, not because you are ready, because you have already demonstrated, in the discipline of getting here, in the honesty of staying, in the courage of looking, that you are exactly the kind of person who does things before they feel ready. The signal has been pointing at this for longer than you knew. You already know the direction. The pressure is yours now. Use it.